They had nothing but cold roads beneath their feet and empty stomachs to quiet their nights, until a deserted barn became their only refuge. What began as survival soon unraveled into something no one could have imagined. Hidden carvings, secret journals, heirloom seeds, crates of forgotten wealth, and a golden chest buried beneath stone. But with treasure comes danger, and men who would stop at nothing to seize it. How did a homeless family become the guardians of a legacy meant to outlast centuries? And what price would they pay to protect it? Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The road stretched ahead like a ribbon of cracked asphalt, each step echoing in the silence of the countryside. Daniel Rivera adjusted the worn strap of the duffel bag on his shoulder, the weight digging into a spot that had long since grown numb. Beside him, Elena walked with her arms wrapped tightly around herself, not just against the chill, but against the gnawing fear of another night without shelter. Their children, Sofia and Mateo, trudged just behind them, the rhythm of their footsteps uneven and tired. The sun was slipping beneath the horizon, leaving streaks of pale orange fading quickly into the deep blue of oncoming night. A bitter wind cut across the fields, carrying the faint smell of hay and the sharp tang of smoke from some distant farmhouse chimney. Sophia hugged her jacket tighter, though it was too thin for the cold. She held a small stuffed rabbit under her arm, its fur matted from years of wear, but still clutched like a shield against the world. She looked up at her father, her breath visible in the air. "Daddy, how much longer?" Her voice was soft, a mixture of hope and fatigue. Daniel slowed his steps, glancing back at her. His face was shadowed by exhaustion, but he forced a smile. "Not much longer, Mija. Just until we find a place that keeps the wind out." It was the same answer he had given every night for weeks, but he made sure it still sounded steady. Mateo walked in silence, his taller frame bent forward, his hands shoved deep in the pockets of a hoodie 2 sizes too small. At 15, he carried himself with a hardness that didn't belong to his age, the quiet anger of someone who had grown up too fast. He scanned the fields on either side of the road, his eyes sharp, looking for anything, an outbuilding, an abandoned shed, any structure that could serve as more than a patch of dirt under the stars. "There's nothing out here," he muttered finally, not to anyone in particular, but to the cold air itself. Elena turned her head, her dark hair whipping across her face in the wind. "There's always something," she said, though her voice trembled. The landscape was empty except for miles of bare trees and open fields, their crops already harvested and the soil frozen hard. Here and there, fences leaned under their own weight, and the occasional farmhouse stood distant, its lights glowing warm and unreachable. Daniel kept his eyes ahead, his mind replaying the last week's string of failures. Shelters filled to capacity, friends who didn't answer the door, a job lead that evaporated the moment he mentioned he had no permanent address. Each rejection had carved a deeper line in his face, but he kept walking, because stopping meant surrendering to despair. The first stars appeared as the light drained from the sky, and Sophia stumbled on a crack in the road. Daniel reached back, steadying her with his free hand. "Careful," he whispered. She nodded, her small face pale but determined. Elena reached for Sophia's other hand, squeezing it gently. Their daughter's step steadied under the grip, and for a moment, the family felt less like a group of wanderers and more like a chain holding each other up against the night. Mateo stopped suddenly, pointing toward the horizon. "There." His voice cut through the silence, carrying a sharp note of urgency. They followed his finger and saw it. The faint outline of a structure rising against the sky. Not a house. The angles were wrong, but something larger, longer, with a peaked roof and sloping sides. A barn. Daniel's chest tightened, a mix of relief and caution. From this distance, it looked deserted, its roof sagging slightly, its doors hanging open like tired arms. Still, it was shelter. The last stretch of road seemed longer than all the miles they had walked, their tired feet dragging toward the promise of a roof. The barn stood at the edge of a field gone wild, its one straight fence broken in places, the wood grayed and splintered by years of neglect. Weeds and brittle stalks pushed up against the base of the structure, and the windows were dark, gaping holes with no glass. A sign of abandonment, but also a sign no one would be coming to chase them out. As they stepped off the road and onto the frozen ground of the field, Daniel felt Sophia's small hand slip into his. Her fingers were cold, but the trust in her grip warmed him more than any blanket could. He glanced back at Mateo, who had already climbed over the fence and was striding toward the barn like it was his to claim. Elena followed close behind, her shoulders straight, her jaw tight, as though bracing herself for what they might find inside. By the time they reached the great wooden doors, the last of the light had faded. Daniel pushed against the door, its hinges groaning loudly in protest. The smell that hit them was of dust, dry wood, and something faintly sweet and old. The interior was dark but vast, with broken beams stretching upward like the ribs of some ancient creature. Bits of moonlight filtered through cracks in the roof, falling in silver streaks onto the dirt floor. Daniel stood just inside the threshold, his breath heavy, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. Behind him, Sophia squeezed a rabbit closer. Mateo scanned the shadows with wary curiosity, and Elena's face softened just enough to reveal her relief. For the first time in weeks, they were not under the open sky. It was nothing more than an abandoned barn, but to them, it felt like the walls themselves had offered an arm against the cold. Daniel let the duffel bag drop to the ground, the sound echoing in the hollow space. "This will do," he said quietly, his voice firm, almost reverent. His family gathered close around him, their shadows merging in the pale streaks of light. Outside, the wind continued its endless sweep across the empty fields, but inside the barn, a fragile sense of safety settled over them, fragile yet enough to carry them through one more night. The barn rose out of landscape like a weary sentinel, its weathered boards silvered by decades of sun and rain. Hollow Creek cut a narrow path through the frostbitten fields nearby, its thin trickle of water catching the last of the day's dim light. Daniel slowed his steps as they approached, his breath visible in sharp clouds. To anyone else, it might have looked like a ruin, something one would drive past without a second thought. But to a family with nowhere else to go, its shape against the horizon was enough to stir the fragile hope of shelter. The doors hung open just enough to reveal darkness inside. One leaned heavily on its rusted hinge, the other tilted as if one more storm might tear it free entirely. The roof sagged in the middle, weighed down by years of neglect, yet still clung stubbornly to the beams that held it aloft. The walls, patched with boards of differing colors and grains, bore scars of countless seasons, but they stood. For Daniel, that was enough. His children needed a place where the wind wouldn't pierce so deeply, where the ground was not open and exposed. Mateo was the first across the fence line, his steps eager despite the weariness in his legs. "It'll keep the rain out," he said, almost as though convincing himself. He glanced back at his sister, who lagged slightly behind, clutching her stuffed rabbit as though the small toy could guard her from the night. Sophia's eyes were wide, uncertain, but they brightened at the thought of a roof, however broken. Elena reached for her shoulder, guiding her gently forward, while her own gaze swept across the barn with caution. She had grown accustomed to disappointment, to places that promised comfort but delivered only more hardship. Daniel pressed his hand against the door and gave it a push. The hinge screamed, a sound so sharp it echoed across the empty fields, and the family instinctively froze, as though the world might take notice of their intrusion. When nothing stirred, Daniel drew in a slow breath and stepped inside. Dust spiraled upward from the ground with each footfall, catching threads of moonlight that slipped through holes in the roof. The barn was cavernous, its wooden ribs arching above them, rafters crisscrossing like the skeleton of some long-forgotten beast. The floor was layered with straw so old it crumbled underfoot, mixed with dirt and fragments of wood. In the far corner, a rusted plow leaned against the wall, its iron blade dulled by time. An overturned bucket, a broken ladder, a scattering of glass bottles. These were the remains of work that had once defined place, now abandoned to silence. A draft moved through the gaps in the walls, carrying the smell of dust, earth, and something faintly sweet, perhaps remnants of old hay. Sophia pressed close to her mother, whispering, "Do we have to stay here?" Her voice trembled, but there was also a note of exhaustion. Elena knelt down, brushing Sophia's hair gently from her face. "Just for tonight, mi amor," she said softly. "It's better than sleeping under the stars." Her own words were half comfort, half plea to herself. Mateo climbed up the first rungs of the loft ladder, testing its strength with each step. It creaked but held, and he looked down with a small smile. "We can sleep up here," he suggested. "It'll be warmer." His attempt at leadership carried the edge of a boy trying too hard to be a man, but Daniel appreciated the effort. He gave a nod, setting the duffel bag on the ground and kneeling to unroll the thin blanket they carried. Elena helped spread it out, while Daniel checked the walls for signs of animals, or worse, intruders. The barn seemed untouched, abandoned for years, its solitude broken only by the sound of the creek trickling just beyond the field. For the first time that day, Daniel allowed himself a breath that wasn't filled with panic. It wasn't much, but it was theirs for the night. As darkness deepened, the barn's silence became its own strange comfort. The air was cold but still, and the walls seemed to hold back the endless sweep of the wind. Sophia settled beside her mother, tucking the stuffed rabbit under her chin, her eyes growing heavy as she leaned against Elena's shoulder. Mateo stretched out on the boards of the loft, staring up at the fractured roof where stars blinked through the cracks. "It's not so bad," he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. Daniel sat with his back against the beam, listening to the creek outside and the shallow breathing of his family. His body ached from the miles, but he felt something stir inside him, a determination not to let the barn be just another stop in a line of disappointments. The walls stood, however weak, and they stood with him. He imagined the men who had built them, their sweat pressing to every beam, their hope for permanence still clinging to the structure even after all these years. The barn was falling apart, but in its brokenness, it offered them refuge. Daniel closed his eyes, resting his head against the rough wood. For tonight, it would be enough. Tomorrow would bring its own battles. But tonight his family was together, sheltered, and for the first time in days, he let himself believe they might have stumbled onto something more than just a roof against the cold. The barn seemed larger in the stillness of night, its emptiness magnified by the sound of the family settling into corners where the wind didn't reach. Daniel knelt by the duffel bag, pulling out the few belongings they carried. A thin blanket, a couple of jackets, and a tin of crackers that rattled faintly when he set it down. He spread the blanket across a patch of old straw, brushing away sharp splinters and bits of glass with his hands. The straw crumbled, dry and brittle, but it softened the wooden floor enough to create the illusion of comfort. Elena guided Sophia to sit beside her, the little girl holding her stuffed rabbit close, its button eye glinting in the dim moonlight. "We'll make this work," Elena said, though her voice was hushed, as though afraid the barn itself might overhear. She tucked Sophia's hair behind her ear, then adjusted the girl's jacket around her shoulders. The cold seeped through every gap in the walls, but it was different from the open sky. It was contained, muffled by wood and straw. Mateo climbed down from the loft, carrying with him a plank he had pried loose. He laid it flat across two overturned buckets and grinned faintly. "A table," he said, though the words sounded too grand for the crude arrangement. Daniel allowed himself a smile at his son's effort. The boy was always trying to prove his usefulness, to show that he could do more than his years allowed. Elena, watching him, felt a tug of pride and sorrow all at once. The barn smelled of age, dust, and the faint sweetness of hay long gone. Their voices echoed softly in the high rafters, filling the space with warmth it had not known in decades. Outside, Hollow Creek whispered over stones, its sound weaving in and out of the barn's silence. It felt almost like a heartbeat, steady and constant, a reminder that life moved on even here, on the edges of forgotten land. As they ate from the tin of crackers, passing them one by one, Daniel cleared his throat. He had been waiting for the right moment, but he knew it could not wait longer. "Listen," he began, his voice steady but carrying the weight of command. "We'll stay here, not just tonight, as long as we need to." His eyes moved from Elena to Mateo, then to Sophia. "But no one can know. Not the town, not the people at the church, not anyone. This is ours, just for us." Sophia looked up, her big eyes reflecting the streaks of moonlight that filtered to the broken roof. "Why can't we tell?" she asked, her voice small. Elena pulled her close, resting the girl's head against her chest. "Because if people know," she answered softly, "they might take it away. They might not understand." Mateo nodded slowly. He already knew. He had seen the way people looked at them when they walked into town, the way conversations went quiet and eyes turned away. To admit they were living in a barn would mean ridicule at best, trouble at worst. "It's a secret," he said, meeting his father's gaze. "We keep it between us." Daniel gave a firm nod. A pact, then. No one speaks of this place. He held out his hand, rough and calloused, waiting. Elena placed her hand on top of his, her fingers thin but strong. Mateo followed, his hand heavier, more certain than his age suggested. Finally, Sophia pressed her small hand on top of theirs, the stuffed rabbit clutched under her other arm. For a moment, they stayed like that, their hands stacked together, the bond of silence stronger than words. The wind rattled the barn's loose boards, as though testing the strength of their promise. But inside, the family felt the first fragile sense of belonging they had known in weeks. It was not home, not yet, but it was theirs to claim, theirs to protect. They spread more straw across the floor, arranging it into uneven beds. Mateo insisted on taking the loft, claiming it would keep him watchful, though Daniel recognized it as the boy's way of pretending strength. Elena curled on the ground with Sophia, wrapping the blanket around them both, while Daniel sat upright against one of the heavy beams. His eyes scanned the barn, listening for every creak and whisper, his body refusing to rest even when his heart longed for it. Sophia whispered something before drifting to sleep, her words muffled against her mother's jacket. Elena smiled faintly, stroking her daughter's hair. "She says the barn feels safe," she whispered to Daniel across the shadows. He nodded, though he didn't trust the walls yet. He would not until days passed without interruption. Still, hearing the words from his little girl loosened something in his chest. The night stretched long, the cold deepened, and the barn creaked as though remembering the weight of those who had once built it. But within those walls, a family made a quiet pact, their voices low and resolute. No one would know, no one would take this away. For the first time in too long, they had a roof, and the promise that tomorrow will be faced together, in silence and in secrecy. Moonlight slipped through cracks in the barn's roof, falling in narrow beams across the dirt floor and scattering silver streaks over the wooden supports. Sophia lay awake long after her mother and brother had settled into uneasy sleep, the stuffed rabbit clutched against her chest. The barn was not silent. Its timbers groaned in the wind, and now and then a bird startled in the rafters, sending faint rustles through the dark. But what kept her eyes open was not fear of the night. It was a sense that the walls themselves were waiting, holding secrets too heavy for sleep to smother. She sat up, careful not to wake her mother, and let her eyes wander across the wooden beams. The light revealed patterns that didn't seem random. Lines burned deep into the wood, not like scratches from tools or the careless marks of farm work. These were deliberate, shaped into loops, triangles, and spirals. She reached out with her fingers and traced them, her small hand gliding over grooves that were smooth, as though someone had polished them long ago. The symbols had an almost deliberate rhythm, like words she couldn't read. Daniel, who had been leaning against one of the larger posts in the barn, noticed her movements and stirred. His body was weary, but a father's instinct never slept. "What are you looking at, Mija?" he asked, his voice low, careful not to wake the others. Sophia glanced back at him, her eyes wide in the dim light. "They're drawings," she whispered. "They don't look like farmers' marks." Daniel pushed himself up with a groan and crossed the floor, kneeling beside her. He brushed his fingers across the carvings, his rough skin catching on the grooves. Farmers often left marks, initials, measurements, notches for tools, but this was something else entirely. Each symbol seemed carefully placed, burned rather than cut, as if fire had kissed the beams to leave its story. He frowned, studying the patterns with the eye of someone trained to measure structure, to see if a beam carried weight correctly. But these were not practical, not structural. They were messages, though in a language he did not know. Elena stirred at the sound of their whispers and lifted her head. "What is it?" she asked, her voice edged with fatigue. Daniel gestured toward the beam. "Carvings, not the usual kind." Elena joined them, her dark hair falling loose around her shoulders. She looked closely, running her hand across the strange spirals and crosses etched into the surface. "They look old," she murmured. "Older than the barn itself, maybe. Mateo climbed down from the loft, rubbing his eyes. "What are you all staring at?" His tone carried more annoyance than curiosity, but when he saw the patterns, his frown deepened. "That's weird. Farmers don't waste time drawing on wood. They work." He leaned closer, tilting his head. "It looks like a code or something." The family gathered around the beam, the cold night forgotten for a moment as their attention fixed on the mysterious marks. Sophia's eyes shone as she traced the shapes again, slower this time, careful to memorize each curve. "It feels like someone wanted us to find it," she whispered, as though the barn itself might hear her words. Daniel's thoughts flickered to stories he'd heard as a boy, whispered by his grandfather about farmers who had valuables during hard times, marking their hiding places with symbols. But these were not the crude signs of men hiding tools from neighbors. They were precise, purposeful. He wondered who had once stood here, burning these lines into the wood, and what they had wanted to preserve. The wind rattled the boards, carrying the hollow sound of the creek outside. Elena shivered and drew Sophia close. "Whatever it is, we don't speak of it," she said quietly, her voice carrying a sharpness that made Mateo glance at her. "We can't have people thinking there's anything here worth taking." Daniel nodded slowly, though his mind continued to race. Secrets carved into a barn meant someone, long ago, had left behind more than dust and straw. Sophia, however, felt none of her mother's caution. Her imagination soared as she looked at the symbols, seeing stories in them. One spiral looked like the sun, another like a star, and one pattern reminded her of the way rivers bent through valleys. She sketched them with her finger on the dusty floor, recreating the designs as best as she could. "Maybe it's a map," she suggested, her young voice full of certainty, "or a message for whoever finds it." Mateo shook his head, but his eyes lingered longer on the carvings than he wanted to admit. He didn't believe in magic or hidden messages, but he couldn't deny that the marks didn't belong to ordinary farm life. Daniel stayed quiet, weighing his daughter's words. He had learned to distrust hope. It often led to disappointment, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the barn held more than broken boards and dust. The family returned to their makeshift beds, but none of them drifted to sleep as easily as before. The wind pressed through the cracks, whispering against the old wood, and the symbols seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight, as though the barn itself was aware of their discovery. Daniel lay awake longest, staring at the beams above, his mind restless. He didn't yet know what the carvings meant, but he understood one thing clearly. The barn had a past, and they had just brushed against it. Somewhere in its walls, something waited, and by stepping inside, they had already become part of its story. The morning crept into the barn through fractured slats, turning the air a pale gray and scattering light across the rafters. Mateo stirred before the others, his long limbs stiff from the rough boards of the loft. He stretched, wincing at the ache in his shoulders, then lay still for a moment listening to the sound below. His father steady breathing against the beam, the faint rustle as Elena shifted to keep Sophia warm. The barn was cold, but was theirs for now, and that strange sense of belonging gnawed at him more than the hunger in his stomach. He felt older than he wanted to be, responsible in ways he hadn't asked for, and so while the others slept, he turned his attention to the shadows of the loft. The floor up there was a mess of straw, dust, and forgotten scraps of wood. Pigeons had nested in the corners once, leaving stains and feathers scattered across the planks. Mateo crouched low and began to push aside layers of hay that crumbled into dust beneath his fingers. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, maybe nothing at all, but he had grown used to searching, to never letting anything slip by unnoticed. When you carried your family's survival in small gestures, even scraps could become treasures. He uncovered a pile of rusted tools first. The metal was eaten with orange corrosion, the handle splintered from years of damp and neglect. A hammer with half its head missing, a saw with broken teeth, nails fused into clumps by rust. He picked one up, turning it in his hand, then set it aside. Useless for work, yet strangely powerful to touch, as though the tool still remembered the weight of labor that had once filled the barn. He wiped his palms against his jeans and kept digging, the dust rising around him, tickling his throat. Near the far edge of the loft, beneath a patch where the roof sagged and water had leaked through, he hit something solid. The sound was different, not the hollow creak of wood or the crunch of straw, but muted thud. He cleared away more hay, his pulse quickening despite himself. Buried under years of neglect was a wooden chest, its surface darkened with age and its corners wrapped in iron bands that were streaked with rust. The lid bore deep scratches, perhaps from animals or simply the passing of time, but the shape was unmistakable. A box made to hold something meant to last. He leaned closer, brushing away the last clumps of straw, and tugged at the lid. It resisted. A thick iron lock hung from the latch, rusted but still stubbornly intact. He tried pulling harder, but the lock held fast. His hands trembled with a mixture of frustration and excitement. It was a kind of discovery he had only seen in stories, something hidden and waiting, as if the barn itself had been guarding it. He sat back on his heels, staring at it, wondering who had put it there and why it had been left behind. The noise of his movements woke Sophia below. "Mateo," she called sleepily, her voice carrying through the barn. "What are you doing up there?" He hesitated, looking down through the gaps in the loft floor. "Just looking," he answered, unwilling to share the find yet. A strange instinct told him to keep it quiet, at least for now. He wasn't ready to see the chest turn into another argument about survival versus dreams. But Daniel had also stirred, and soon his father's voice joined in, steady but curious. "What have you got there?" Mateo swallowed, then leaned down so they could hear him better. "Something," he said. "A box. It's locked." His words brought both Sophia and Elena to their feet, their exhaustion forgotten in an instant. They watched as Daniel climbed the ladder up into the loft, his eyes narrowing when he saw the chest. He knelt beside his son, his hand resting on the iron lock. The two of them sat in silence for a long moment, father and son, staring at the thing that seemed out of place in an abandoned barn. Daniel finally exhaled, a sound between wonder and caution. "This didn't belong to any farmer, just keeping tools," he murmured. "Someone hid this here." Mateo's chest swelled with quiet pride. He had found it not by chance but by persistence, by refusing to stop looking when everything else told him to just survive. The chest was heavy with secrets, and though they couldn't open it yet, it was proof that the barn was more than a shell. It held a story they had only begun to uncover. Daniel tried the lock again, pulling at it with a strength that came from years of labor, but it refused to give. "We'll need a key," he said finally, his voice low. Mateo glanced at him, a spark in his eyes that had been missing for months. "Then we'll find it," he replied, with a certainty that surprised even him. "Below." Sophia pressed her small hands against the beam and whispered, "What do you think is inside?" No one answered, but all of them felt the question hang in the air, heavier than the dust that floated in the shafts of morning light. The barn was no longer just a refuge. It had become a mystery, and Mateo's discovery had drawn them all into it. Night in the barn was different from the day. In daylight, the beams looked worn but sturdy, the air filled with dust and the faint smell of old hay. At night, however, the structure seemed to come alive in ways none of them could ignore. The wind found every crack, every splintered seam, and forced its way inside. It pressed against the boards, slipping through gaps to create long, drawn-out whistles that rose and fell like sighs. Sometimes it rushed fast, rattling the loose doors so they banged softly against their hinges. Other times it moved low and slow, curling around the beams in tones that carried the eerie cadence of voices. Elena sat close to Sophia, her daughter tucked beneath the thin blanket they shared. She held her hands together and whispered prayers under her breath, the kind she had learned as a girl, words that were supposed to steady the heart. But the sound of the barn unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. It was too much like murmuring, as if unseen figures lingered in the rafters, speaking a language no one could understand. She pulled Sophia closer, pressing a kiss against her hair, whispering that it was only the wind. Still, she kept praying, her eyes fixed on the wooden beams above. Mateo shifted restlessly in the loft, unable to close his eyes. The chest he had discovered earlier sat half buried in the hay nearby, its presence stirring his imagination. When the wind moved across the boards, it almost felt as if the chest itself was humming. He pressed his palms against his ears, but the sound remained, carried through the vibrations of the barn itself. He told himself it was nonsense, but his body refused to relax. The voices rose again in long, uneven tones, some low, some sharp, weaving together into something that reminded him of chanting. He turned over, pulling his jacket tighter around his shoulders, pretending the sound didn't matter. Daniel sat upright near the ladder, his back against a thick post, eyes open. He watched his family's unease and felt the burden of his role more than ever. "It's the wind," he said aloud, his voice strong enough to reach both the loft and the ground. "Just the wind through the boards. Nothing else." His words carried authority, but inside, he too felt the strangeness of the sounds. He had worked in construction. He knew the way buildings moved in weather. He could explain groaning beams and rattling hinges. Yet here, with the storm outside pressing against him, he could not shake the sense that the barn was breathing. Sophia stirred beneath the blanket and lifted her head. "Papa, are they talking to us?" Her voice was a fragile whisper, but it carried in the hollow space. Daniel forced a calm smile, though his heart sank at her words. "No, Mija," he answered softly. "It's only the air. The barn is old, and old would make strange sounds." He stood, brushing his palms against his jeans, and walked across the floor, dragging his fingers along the walls to show her they were solid. The boards rattled beneath his touch, vibrating with the steady push of wind. "See? Just the weather." But Elena caught his eyes in the dim light. Her prayers still murmured under her breath. She was not convinced, and he could see it. For her, the barn was too close to the grave, too full of history. Places like this remembered things. She tightened her arms around Sophia and whispered another prayer. Faster now, her lips brushing against the crown of her daughter's head. A sudden gust pushed through, loud and shrill, slamming the doors open just enough to send cold air sweeping across the floor. The sound swelled in the rafters, rising in pitch until it seemed almost like laughter. Sophia buried her face against her mother's chest, trembling. Mateo sat up sharply in the loft, his fists clenched. Daniel strode across the barn and pulled the door shut again, though with groaning as he forced the latch into place. When the gust faded, silence fell heavy, interrupted only by the shallow breaths of his children. Daniel returned to the beam and lowered himself to the ground. "You're safe," he said firmly, his voice leaving no room for doubt. "This barn is ours tonight. Nothing here can harm you." His tone was steady, but his hand trembled slightly as he rested it on his knee. The wind returned, quieter now, moving in soft murmurs through the cracks. To Sophia, it still sounded like voices, but she clung to her father's words as tightly as she clung to her rabbit. Elena closed her eyes and prayed more quietly, her lips moving without sound. Mateo lay back down, staring at the chest, wondering if the voices belonged to something locked inside. And Daniel, though he spoke of safety and reason, could not ignore the rhythm of the barn's noises. They rose and fell like breath, long inhalations and heavy exhalations, a structure alive with memory. He leaned against the beam and kept his eyes open until dawn, determined to meet the whispers not with fear, but with silence of his own. The next afternoon the barn was quiet except for the rustle of straw beneath small feet. Sophia wandered while her brother busied himself in the loft, and her parents worked near the entrance, trying to mend a gap in the wall with broken boards. She carried her stuffed rabbit in one hand, dragging it through the dirt as she searched for something to occupy her mind. The barn was full of shadows that shifted with the light, corners where dust collected in thick blankets, and beams that seemed to hum faintly when the wind pressed against them. To her, it was less a shelter than a puzzle waiting to be solved. She stopped near one of the stalls at the far end of the structure, where the wood had rotted at the base and collapsed inward, pushing aside a pile of broken planks. She noticed a glint beneath the straw. Curiosity quickened her steps, and she knelt down, brushing away layers of dust with the edge of her sleeve. What emerged was a small tin box, its surface mottled with rust, its hinges stiff with age. She ran her fingers across the lid and felt the faint outline of a design, a cluster of vines etched into the metal, dull by decades but still visible as she looked closely. Her first instinct was to call for her father, but something told her to open it first, as if the discovery belonged to her alone. She tugged at the latch, coughing as dust rose in a cloud around her. The lid creaked open with reluctant resistance, and inside she found a neat stack of photographs, their corners curled, their sepia tones faded with time. She lifted the first one carefully, her hands trembling with a mixture of excitement and fear. The image revealed a family, 2 parents and 3 children, standing proudly in front of the very same barn. The board behind them were newer then, unscarred by time, the roof whole and strong. The family smiled in their Sunday best, as though the barn were more than a place for animals. Sophia pulled out another photo. This one showed a gathering of neighbors, perhaps 20 people, arranged in front of the barn doors. Men in work shirts, women in dresses, children barefoot in the grass. Some smiled, others stared seriously at the camera, but all of them seemed tied together by the backdrop of the barn. She turned the photo over and noticed faint handwriting in pencil. Whitlock Reunion, 1912. She traced the letters slowly, whispering the words as though reciting a spell. Her mother's voice broke the moment. "Sophia, what are you doing back there?" Elena stood with her hands on her hips, wary of her daughter digging into unsafe corners. Sophia held up the tin box, her face bright with discovery. "Look, pictures." Elena's expression softened as she crossed the barn, brushing straw from her dress as she knelt beside her daughter. She picked up one of the photographs and gasped quietly, "Dios mío." Her eyes lingered on the faces, their clothing, their confidence. "These are so old." She held another one up to the light. "The same barn, it hasn't changed, only aged." Daniel and Mateo soon joined them, curiosity pulling them away from their tasks. Daniel wiped his hands on his jeans and crouched low, careful not to touch the photographs with dirty fingers. "Where did you find this?" he asked. Sophia pointed proudly to the broken stall. It was under the boards. Mateo reached for one of the photos, studying it with narrowed eyes. So this barn belonged to someone important. People don't gather like this for nothing. He flipped the photograph over, reading the faint handwriting. Whitlock must have been the family name. Daniel nodded slowly, memory stirring of local stories he had overheard in passing. He remembered an older man at a gas station mentioning the Whitlocks, a farming family that had prospered in the late 1800s before vanishing without explanation. To see their faces now, preserved in the dust, made those stories less like rumors and more like echoes of truth. Sophia carefully laid out the photographs on a clean plank of wood, arranging them side by side. Each image told a fragment of a larger story. Children playing in front of the barn, women setting out baskets of food, men leaning against wagons. Though faded, the details held life. The smiles were genuine, the gatherings warm, and always the barn stood behind them, strong and central. Elena reached for her daughter's hand, squeezing it. "You found their memories," she whispered, "pieces of their lives hidden here." She looked at Daniel, her eyes shadowed. "It means this place belonged to people who cared for it deeply." Daniel's gaze lingered on the photos, his jaw tightening. "It also means we're not the first to shelter here, and maybe we're not the last." He lifted one of the images, studying the faces as though they might speak. "This barn has been keeping secrets longer than we've been alive." The photographs remained spread before them, the past and present mingling in the dust. Sophia felt a strange connection to the children in the pictures, as though they too had once played and laughed in the same beams of light that now shone on her. She tucked the stuffed rabbit under her arm and whispered softly, almost to herself, "They're still here." Her words made Elena shiver, though she said nothing. Daniel gathered the tin box, sliding the photographs back inside with careful hands. He sat beside the beam, the weight of history pressing heavier than the rusted lock on Mateo's chest. The barn had spoken again, not through whispers in the wind this time, but through faces staring out of faded photographs, smiling across the years as though waiting to be remembered. The day had been long, spent gathering what scraps they could in the surrounding fields, broken branches for fire, dried grass for bedding, anything that might soften the hard edges of their life inside the barn. By the time evening fell, the family returned to their fragile shelter, exhausted and silent. Daniel lingered near one of the side walls while Elena tended to Sophia, brushing straw from her daughter's tangled hair. The wind outside was calm, only a faint rustle moving through the trees, and for once the barn felt less menacing, almost cooperative. Daniel leaned his shoulder against the wall, letting his eyes wander over the aged boards. Most of the planks were solid despite their weathered appearance. But one section caught his attention. It looked uneven, slightly warped as though it had been pried loose before and forced back into place. He ran his hand along it. The wood roughed beneath his fingers and pressed gently. The board shifted with a faint groan. Something stirred in him then, a curiosity sharpened by the chest Matteo had found in the loft and the photographs Sophia had uncovered. The barn was revealing itself piece by piece, and he could not ignore the possibility that more secrets lay waiting. He crouched low, working his fingers into the small gap, and pulled. The board resisted at first, reluctant after decades of silence, but then gave way with a sharp crack. Dust filled the air, rising like smoke, and Daniel coughed as he waved it aside. Behind the plank was a hollow space, just wide enough to conceal something. He reached in carefully, his hand brushing against leather. When he drew it out, the weight of the object sent a thrill through him. It was a book, thick, bound in weather-brown leather that had cracked with age. The cover bore no title, but the edges were blackened by dirt, the corners frayed. Elena noticed him then, her eyes narrowing as she set Sophia aside and approached. "What is it?" she asked softly, wary of stirring excitement before knowing what they held. Daniel lowered himself onto a beam and opened the book. The first pages were stiff, but the ink remained faintly visible, written in an elegant hand. At the top of the page, in looping letters, was a name, Thomas Whitlock, 1871. The children drew close, Matteo leaning over his father's shoulder, Sophia clutching her rabbit as though it could anchor her to the moment. Daniel turned the pages slowly, his eyes scanning the lines. The journal was not a ledger or a list of farm chores, as he had half expected. It was personal, filled with thoughts, worries, and plans. The entry spoke of harvests and weather, yes, but also of gatherings in the barn, meetings with neighbors late into the night. Words like brotherhood, preparations, and secrets surfaced often, written with careful strokes as though meant for posterity, yet shielded from casual eyes. Matteo frowned, trying to follow the script. "What does he mean? The barn must stand as more than shelter?" he asked, his finger tracing the sentence. Daniel did not answer right away. He kept reading, the pages unfolding a story of a man who saw his land not just as livelihood, but as part of something larger. There were mentions of troubled times, financial panic, rumors of violence, fears that the world as they knew it could collapse. The barn, Whitlock wrote, was to be a safeguard, a place to hide what mattered most until it was needed again. Elena shifted uneasily, her arms crossing over her chest. "It sounds like he was hiding things," she murmured, her voice tinged with both awe and dread. Daniel nodded, though his eyes did not leave the page. "Hiding or preserving," he said quietly. He wanted this barn to hold more than animals and hay. He wanted it to remember. Sophia's eyes grew wide, her imagination already racing ahead. "Maybe that's why we're here," she whispered. "Maybe he left it for us to find." Her innocence gave the words a weight that silenced the others. Even Elena, skeptical and wary, did not dismiss the thought outright. Daniel closed the journal for a moment, running his hand over the cracked leather. He felt the presence of the man who had written it, a farmer who had lived and breathed in the very walls surrounding them. The discovery was not just a relic. It was a voice from the past, reaching across generations to whisper truths in the present. He placed the journal carefully on the makeshift plank table Matteo had built and looked at his family. "This barn is not empty," he said, his voice low but steady. "It's been carrying stories, secrets, maybe even treasures, for longer than we've been alive. Thomas Whitlock wanted someone to find this, and now we have." The children leaned closer to the journal, their eyes hungry for more, while Elena lingered in the shadows, her lips pressed together in thought. She feared what might come from stirring the past, but she could not deny the way the barn kept speaking to them, piece by piece. As night fell again and the wind began its low hum through boards, Daniel sat with the journal open in his lap. The words of Thomas Whitlock glimmered in the dim light, a bridge between the lives once lived here and the family now sheltering in its ruins. The barn had chosen to reveal another secret, and with it came the unsettling certainty that more still waited in the dark. Daniel turned the brittle pages carefully, afraid that one wrong move might crumble them to dust. The handwriting shifted in tone as he read deeper, becoming more urgent, less like a farmer recording his harvest, and more like a man carrying a burden he could not share aloud. What began as mentions of neighbors visiting at night slowly revealed itself to be something far stranger. He read of gatherings lit only by lanterns, men huddled in the barn after their families slept, voices lowered, their words sealed with handshakes and silence. Whitlock called them brothers, men bound not just by land and work, but by a conviction that the world around them was fragile and nearing collapse. The children leaned in close, fascinated, while Elena kept her distance, her arms crossed. Daniel cleared his throat and read a passage aloud, the words crackling in the quiet like fire. Asterisk, we cannot trust the banks, nor the state, nor the railroads that bleed us dry. When the famine comes, when the city men devour what little we have, it will be the brotherhood that endures. Here in the barn, we prepare. Asterisk, Mateo frowned. Prepare for what? He asked. Daniel glanced at him, then back at the journal. The entry spoke of food stored in sealed jars, of coins buried in walls, of deeds and papers hidden where no collector would think to look. The men wrote of weapons too, old rifles oiled and ready, locked away not for hunting but for defense. They feared riots, hunger, the collapse of law. Whitlock's words dripped with mistrust of anyone beyond their circle. Elena shook her head slowly. Farmers with a secret society? It sounds like a story made to scare children. But even as she spoke, her eyes betrayed unease. The journal was too detailed, too precise to be dismissed as fancy. The dates, the names of men, the instructions on where to meet and how to signal one another, it all pointed to something deliberate. Sophia picked up on the faded photographs they had found earlier, studying the group of neighbors gathered in front of the barn. Maybe these are them, she whispered. The brothers. Her small finger tapped the faces one by one. Men who stood stiffly, their eyes fixed on the camera with a seriousness that felt heavier now that they knew what had been written. Daniel read further. Whitlock described their meetings as rituals of trust, where each man swore an oath never to betray the barn's purpose. He wrote of carving symbols into beams, marks meant to guide those who came after. To the unknowing eye, they are scratches. One entry read, asterisk, but to us, they are the language of survival. Asterisk, Daniel thought of the carving Sophia had noticed. The spirals and triangles burned into the wood. They were not decorative. They were messages left behind. The more he read, the more Daniel felt the weight of the barn pressing in. This was not just a structure abandoned to time. It had been the heart of a hidden network, a fortress disguised as a farmer's building. And now, by chance or fate, his family had stumbled into it. He closed the journal for a moment, rubbing his temples, aware of the way his children watched him. They believed something terrible was coming, he said finally, and they built this place to outlast it. Mateo's voice carried a mixture of skepticism and awe. So you're saying there might still be things here? Stuff they hid. His eyes lit with the same restless hunger he'd felt when he uncovered the chest. Daniel hesitated. He had no answer yet, only a sense that the walls around him carried more than echoes. Elena lowered herself onto a bale of straw, her face pale. If this is true, she murmured, then this barn isn't safe. Secrets like that don't stay buried forever. She glanced at Daniel, her voice firm despite her fear. We should leave before someone else comes looking. But Daniel shook his head. Something in the journal's words clung to him, a thread he could not cut free from. He thought of the brotherhood meeting in silence, hiding valuables in plain sight, so that their descendants, or perhaps strangers like them, might find them when the time was right. If they had trusted the barn to carry their legacy forward, then abandoning it now felt like betrayal. Sophia leaned her head against her mother's arm, her young voice breaking the silence. Maybe they left it for us, she said again, repeating what she had whispered when the journal was first found. Elena kissed her forehead, unable to agree, unwilling to deny it. Daniel opened the book once more and let his eyes fall on the final lines of one entry. The words, though faded, were sharp enough to pierce him. Asterisk, the barn must outlive us. Within these walls rests the seed of tomorrow. When the world falters, let those who shelter here find what we left behind. Asterisk, The family sat in silence after he read it aloud, the barn around them breathing with the wind. The boards creaked, the beams groaned, and in that hollow music, it almost seemed as if the voices of the Brotherhood lingered still, waiting for someone to hear. The morning sun spread thin across the fields, its light soft but cold, the kind that illuminated without warmth. Mateo and Sophia wandered beyond the barn, their boots crunching over brittle grass and patches of frost. The field stretched wide and empty, broken only by crooked fence posts and the faint glimmer of Hollow Creek winding its way through the land. It was Sophia who noticed the dark shape on the horizon first, a huddle of stones and blackened timbers half swallowed by weeds. She tugged at her brother's sleeve, her small hand pointing. "There!" she whispered, as though the ruins themselves might hear. They approached cautiously, though no one had walked this ground in years. The closer they came, the clearer it became that the ruin had once been a house. Charred beams jutted upward like broken ribs, and fragments of stone foundation traced the outline of walls long gone. Grass and nettles had grown thick around it, but the skeleton of the farmhouse still stood in defiance of time. Mateo crouched to touch the blackened wood, his fingers brushing against splinters that flaked away like ash. He frowned. "Burned," he muttered, almost to himself. "A long time ago." Sophia stayed back a few steps, clutching her rabbit, her eyes wide. She imagined the house alive again. Windows glowing, smoke curling from a chimney, voices spilling out into the yard. But all that remained now were the scars of fire, silent and accusing. She bent down and picked up a shard of porcelain half buried in the dirt, perhaps once part of a plate or a teacup. It was cracked, but still bore the faint trace of painted blue flowers. She held it in her palm as if it were a relic. "Someone lived here," she said softly, her voice carrying more certainty than discovery. Daniel's voice reached them from behind. "The Whitlocks," he said, walking up the lane beside him. He had followed the children once he noticed her absence, the journal still heavy in his thoughts. He looked down at the ruins, his brow furrowed. This must have been their farmhouse. Elena crossed her arms, shivering though the air was still. "What happened?" she asked. Her voice carried suspicion, as if the land itself might answer. Daniel knelt near the charred beams, studying where the wood had collapsed inward. He had seen fire's aftermath before, but this was different. The burn was complete, deliberate almost, as if nothing had been spared. "Hard to say," he replied. "Could have been an accident or not." Mateo straightened, scanning the ruins. If the barn survived, why didn't the house? His eyes narrowed. "Doesn't make sense." The family moved slowly among the remains, careful with each step. Elena bent to pick up a rusted hinge half buried in the soil. Her fingers traced its shape, then dropped it quickly as though it still carried heat. She glanced at Daniel. The journal spoke of secrecy, she reminded him, of a brotherhood afraid of collapse. Maybe this wasn't just fire. Maybe it was silencing. Daniel didn't respond right away. He turned his eyes to the barn in the distance, its shape steady against the horizon. "Whatever happened, someone wanted this house gone," he said finally. His voice was low, almost reverent. Sophia wandered what remained of the doorway, her shoes crunching on stones blackened by flame. She imagined the family in the photograph standing there, smiling on a Sunday morning, unaware of what was coming. A shiver ran through her as she whispered her rabbit. They didn't leave. The fire chased them out. Mateo found a fragment of metal, twisted and warped, that might once have been part of a cooking pot. He turned it over in his hands, then tossed it back to the ground. His jaw tightened. Who would do this? Burn a family's house down? Elena looked at the land around them, the wide, empty fields that stretched in every direction. "Someone with a reason," she said simply. The silence that followed was broken only by the cry of a crow circling overhead. The family stood in the ruins, each of them absorbing the weight of what had been lost here. The farmhouse had been the heart of the Whitlock land, yet it was a barn that endured, holding the secrets of the Brotherhood, while the home was reduced to ashes. Daniel placed a hand on Mateo's shoulder and guided him away. "Come," he said quietly. "The answers aren't here anymore. They're in the barn." As they walked back across the fields, Sophia turned for one last look. The ruins seemed to watch her, the charred beams reaching toward the sky like fingers frozen mid-plea. She clutched her rabbit tighter and hurried to catch up with the others. The fire was long gone, but its echoes lingered in the silence, carrying questions no one had yet dared to ask aloud. The land remembered, and so would they. The light that poured into the barn that morning came in sharp angles, sliding through cracks in the walls and falling across the floor in pale streaks. Dust rose with every step, turning the air into a haze of silver. Sophia wandered near the back, her rabbit tucked beneath her arm, while her father read quietly from the journal, his voice low as he tried to make sense of Thomas Whitlock's looping script. Elena busied herself with arranging what little food they had salvaged, and Mateo shifted impatiently, his eyes darting constantly to the locked chest in the loft, as though it might open by sheer will. The barn felt both alive and still, its silence interrupted only by the murmur of Daniel's reading. Sophia trailed her fingers along the wood as she moved, tracing the grooves where the planks had splintered. She stopped when her hand brushed across a familiar curve, one that tugged at her memory. Tilting her head, she leaned closer, squinting at the mark carved faintly into the board. It was no accident of age or weather. Burned into the wood was a spiral with a small cross at its center. Her heart quickened. She had seen it before. She pulled the rabbit closer and hurried to her father, tugging gently at his sleeve. "Papa," she whispered, pointing toward the journal. "The drawings, show me again." Daniel looked up from the faded ink, his brow furrowed. "What drawings, Mija?" She turned the pages herself with small, careful hands until she found the sketch she remembered. On the margin of one entry, Whitlock had drawn several symbols, spirals, triangles, and lines intersecting like stars. Her small finger pressed against the spiral with the cross. "Here," she said firmly, "it's on the wall." Daniel straightened, closing the journal halfway as he followed her to the back of the barn. Elena noticed their movements and joined them, suspicion clouding her face, while Mateo lingered nearby, curiosity pulling him closer. Sophia stopped at the plank, her finger already on the spiral. "See? It's the same." Daniel bent low, running his rough hand over the mark. The groove was shallow but deliberate, burned into the wood rather than carved. He opened the journal and held it close, comparing the two. The resemblance was undeniable. His pulse quickened. "She's right," he murmured. "It matches." Mateo crouched beside him, his voice sharp with excitement. "So these aren't just doodles. They're code." He looked around, scanning the other planks, his eyes darting across the barn as though the walls themselves had come alive. Elena folded her arms tightly, unease sharpening her features. "Codes. Society's hidden things," she muttered. "It's too much. A barn is supposed to shelter, not whisper secrets." But even she leaned closer, her gaze following the lines burned into the wood. There was no mistaking their purpose. As Daniel turned another page, more sketches appeared in the margins. Some resembled suns, others rivers, and a few resembled constellations. Whitlock had written beside them, "Marks of brethren, so they may find without asking, so they may see without speaking." Daniel read the words aloud, his voice heavy with awe. The family began searching the walls together, each of them running their hands across the planks. More symbols revealed themselves under layers of grime and dust. A triangle etched near the floor, a circle with a slash burned faintly into the beam by the loft ladder, lines shaped like arrows pointing inward toward the heart of the barn. Sophia spotted another spiral, smaller this time, at the base of a corner post. She crouched and pressed her palm against it, whispering to herself as though speaking directly to the past. Mateo grew more restless with each discovery. "They left instructions," he said. "Clues. It's like they wanted someone to follow the path." His eyes gleamed with the same fire he had when he uncovered the chest. Elena shook her head, her voice trembling with equal parts fear and disbelief. Or they wanted to make sure no one could ever forget what was hidden here. Daniel stood back, journal in hand, his gaze sweeping across the barn. The marks were not random. Together, they formed a pattern, a language etched into wood, guiding those who knew how to read it. He thought of Whitlock writing in the 1870s, of men gathering in silence while the rest of the town slept, leaving behind signs for future eyes. And now his daughter, innocent and curious, had been the first to see them for what they truly were. He closed the journal slowly, his hand lingering on the cracked leather cover. "These walls were never just walls," he said quietly, almost reverently. "They're a map." His words hung heavy in the air, sinking into each of them. The barn creaked as a gust of wind pressed against it, the sound sliding to the boards in a long, hollow sigh. The family stood in silence, the weight of discovery pressing on their chests. Sophia reached up and slipped her small hand into her father's, her eyes fixed on the spiral in the wall. She didn't need the words to understand that the barn was alive with memory and that the Whitlocks had left more than symbols behind. They had left an invitation. The barn was colder than usual that evening, the air damp and heavy, sinking into their bones as the sun dropped behind the fields. Elena sat with her back against a beam, her arms wrapped tightly around Sophia, who had already drifted into sleep. The little girl's head rested on her mother's chest, her small breath steady and shallow. Elena smoothed strands of hair from her daughter's face, though her own eyes were distant, fixed on the faint outlines of the rafters above. Every sound of the barn seemed louder to her now. The groaning timbers, the faint whistle of wind, the scratch of mice moving unseen in the straw. Daniel was crouched near the makeshift table Mateo had fashioned, the leather journal open before him, his face illuminated by the weak glow of a lantern they had managed to piece together with scraps of glass and oil. His brow was furrowed in concentration as he read, his finger moving along the faded ink, tracing words written more than a century ago. Mateo leaned over his shoulder, restless and eager, whispering questions that tumbled over each other, his imagination feeding on every strange passage. Elena watched them both, her unease deepening. The barn had become less a shelter and more a place of discovery, each day pulling them further from the fight for survival and deeper into puzzles carved into walls or written in the margins of an old farmer's hand. She pressed her lips together and finally spoke, her voice low but firm enough to carry through the hollow space. "Daniel," she said, and he looked up, blinking as though pulled from a dream. "This is not what we need right now." He frowned, setting his hand over the page. "What do you mean?" She shifted Sophia gently so she could face him fully, her eyes sharp in the dim light. "Food, Daniel. Warmth. Safety. That is what we need. Not symbols on walls, not the ramblings of a dead man in a book. You're chasing shadows while our children sleep on straw." Mateo bristled immediately. "They're not shadows. You saw the marks, Mama. You saw the photographs. It's real." Elena shook her head, her voice rising just enough to silence him. "Real doesn't mean it will feed us. Real doesn't mean it will keep us alive when the frost comes harder. What good is a map or a secret if we don't survive long enough to use it?" Daniel closed the journal slowly, his jaw tightening. He understood her words, felt the truth of them, but something in him resisted letting go. The journal, the chest, the symbols, they were more than coincidence. He had spent too many days watching hope vanish to dismiss what now shimmered faintly before him. Yet Elena's gaze cut through his conviction, grounding him in the sharp reality of hunger and cold. "We can't afford to lose ourselves in this," she continued, her voice softening but carrying more weight. "Do you remember last winter? The nights when we had nothing but an empty fire pit and prayers? We are one step from that again. If you waste your strength digging through walls while we starve, what happens to them?" She looked down at Sophia, her hand stroking the girl's small arm, then back to Mateo, who crossed his arms defiantly but could not hide the flicker of doubt in his eyes. Daniel rubbed his hands over his face, exhaustion carving itself into his features. "I can't ignore it, Elena. This barn isn't just rotting wood. There's something here, something Whitlock wanted people to find." She leaned forward, her eyes shining with both fear and frustration. "And if finding it costs us our health, our children's safety, what then? Do we trade full stomachs for mysteries? Do we let our children freeze because you believe a dead man buried fortune under these beams?" Silence stretched between them, broken only by the moan of the wind against the boards. Daniel's shoulders sagged as he stared at the journal, torn between the pull of its secrets and the truth in Elena's words. He thought of the chest locked in the loft, the photographs of smiling families who had once stood where they stood now. Could he walk away from the possibility that something within this barn could change everything? Yet he could not deny the hollow ache in his children's bellies, the cough that had begun to catch in Sophia's throat at night. Elena's hand reached for his, her fingers cold but steady. "Please, Daniel," she whispered, "don't let this place trick you. Don't let it take you from us. We need you here, not chasing ghosts." He looked at her, at the weariness etched into her face, the quiet strength that had carried him this far. His grip tightened around her hand. For a long time neither spoke, the weight of unspoken choices pressing down on them both. The journal lay closed on the table, its cracked leather cover seeming to pulse faintly in the shadows, as if waiting for him to return. But for that night, Daniel kept his eyes on Elena, her doubt shaping his silence more powerfully than any words could. The day had been heavy with silence, each member of the family lost in their own thoughts after Elena's words the night before. The journal remained closed on the plank table, its cracked leather spine untouched, though Daniel's eyes drifted toward it more often than not. Outside, the field stretched barren beneath a gray sky, the cold pressing tighter as winter crept closer. Inside the barn, the air smelled of dust and damp wood, the kind of scent that clung to clothing and hair. Mateo was restless. He could not sit with folded hands while his mother warned against chasing secrets. He could not look at the chest in the loft without feeling its locked silence taunting him. And more than anything, he could not ignore the marks they had found, the spirals and triangles etched into beams like invitations meant for those who noticed. If his father hesitated and his mother doubted, then it would be up to him. He carried himself with seriousness beyond his years. The sharp edge of youth hardened too early, and that sharpness drove him now. He dragged a broken piece of iron across the barn floor, its screech pulling Sophia's eyes from her play and making Elena glance up in disapproval. He ignored them, heading toward one of the great beams near the corner, the one he had run his hand across the day before. It had sounded different, a hollow thud instead of the solid ring of oak. Kneeling, he tapped it again with his knuckles. The sound confirmed what his instinct already knew. There was space inside. Sophia crept closer, curiosity sparking in her eyes. "What are you doing?" she whispered. He didn't answer, only wedged a jagged iron edge against the seam where two planks met. With a grunt, he pressed his weight into it. The wood resisted, groaning under the pressure, flakes of dust raining down as if protesting. Elena noticed and rose quickly, her face tightening. "Mateo, stop," she said, her voice sharp. But he pressed harder, his jaw set, the determination in him drowning out her words. The plank shifted suddenly, a hollow crack, splitting the air. Sophia gasped as a thin opening appeared, wide enough to see darkness behind it. Mateo shoved again, pulling the board free from its place. Inside, dust swirled in a narrow cavity carved into the beam itself. He reached his hand inside, fingers brushing against something cool and smooth. Carefully, he pulled it out, a glass jar, sealed tight with wax that had darkened with age. Inside, through the film of dust and grime, something gleamed faintly. Coins. Sophia's eyes widened, her hands clasped over her mouth. Elena froze in place, torn between scolding and awe. Daniel finally moved from his silence, stepping forward slowly, as though approaching something sacred. Mateo held the jar up to the light, streaming through the cracks in the wall, the coins glinting in the weak sunlight. They were old, their surfaces dulled but not erased by time. The faint outlines of eagles, stars, and dates from the 1800s stared back at them, relics from a century past sealed away in secret. Daniel took the jar gently, turning it in his hands. His breath caught at the weight of it. He had held coins like these once in a museum, behind glass, untouchable. Yet here they were in his hands, found by his son in the bones of a barn meant only to be a temporary refuge. His voice was low when he spoke. "These are real. Silver. Maybe more." Elena stepped closer, her expression a storm of emotions. Fear, relief, anger at being proven wrong, and a quiet flicker of hope she could not entirely extinguish. "Coins won't keep us warm," she said softly, though her eyes lingered on the jar. Mateo's face lit with triumph, though he kept his tone steady. "But it means the stories were true. The Brotherhood hid things here." He looked at his father. If this is one jar, there could be more. Daniel set the jar carefully on the plank table, his fingers trembling as they released it. Sophia touched the glass lightly, as if greeting an old friend. Her small voice filled the silence. It's like they wanted us to find it, like they knew someone would need it. For a long moment, no one moved. The bar around them seemed to breathe, the symbols on the walls more alive now than ever before. Daniel stared at the jar, caught between Elena's warnings and the undeniable truth of what lay before them. They had uncovered proof. Not just whispers in a journal, not just fading photographs, but solid, weighty evidence that the Whitlocks and their brotherhood had hidden their legacy here. The discovery filled the barn with both hope and unease. It was more than survival, more than curiosity. It was the beginning of a path they could no longer pretend not to see. And as the wind sighed through the cracks, rattling the boards, it seemed to carry with a faint clink of coins long buried, now stirring to life in the hands of strangers who had become their heirs. The evening had settled in slowly, the fields turning from pale gold to deep gray as the last of the sun slipped behind the distant hills. The barn's hollow walls glowed faintly with the light of the lantern Daniel had lit, its flicker casting long, uneasy shadows across the beams. The family huddled close around their meager supper, a few stale crackers and what remained of a loaf taken from a church pantry days before. Sophia leaned against her mother, her eyes half closed, while Mateo sat apart, staring at the jar of old coins on the plank table as though it were a living thing. The sound of tires on gravel cut through the quiet. It was faint at first, so faint Daniel thought he imagined it. He stiffened, his head turning toward the barn doors. Elena caught the change in his posture immediately, her own breath hitching as she clutched Sophia tighter. The rumble grew louder, approaching from the road that wound past Hollow Creek. Through the gap in the barn wall, a beam of light split the darkness. It swept across the field, pale and searching, before landing briefly on the barn itself. Daniel rose slowly to his feet, motioning for silence. Mateo froze in place, his hands tightening into fists. The rumble slowed, then stopped. Headlights glared from the road. A vehicle sat there, engine humming low, its lights burning into the field. It was large, dark, unmistakably modern, a black SUV. Daniel's chest tightened. Nothing about it fit the landscape of broken fences and empty fields. Whoever sat behind that will did not belong to the loneliness of this land. For a long moment, no one moved. The SUV remained still, idling, its light spilling across the frost-stiff grass. Daniel moved closer to the crack in the wall, peering out cautiously. The windows of the vehicle were tinted, the faces inside hidden. It lingered, silent and watching. Sophia stirred against her mother, whispering, "Papa, who is it?" Elena hushed her quickly, pulling her close, her eyes fixed on Daniel. He didn't answer. He couldn't. His mind raced with possibilities. The land's rightful owner, a stranger passing by, or someone who already knew what the barn carried within its walls. Mateo crept toward the gap beside his father, his voice low and sharp. "They're watching us." Daniel put a hand out, stopping him. "Stay back." The SUV remained motionless for another minute. Though the family, it felt like an eternity. Then, slowly, it rolled forward again, its headlights sweeping one last time across the barn before turning down the road. The sound of tires crunching on gravel faded into the night until there was nothing but silence. Only then did Daniel exhale, the breath leaving his chest like a stone dropping into water. Elena's voice was taut, trembling with anger and fear. "They know," she whispered. "Whoever that was, they know someone is here." Mateo clenched his jaw, his eyes flashing. Maybe they're after the same thing. The journal, the chest, the coins. Daniel turned from the wall, his face hard in the dim light. Maybe, or maybe they just saw an old barn on the edge of a dead farm. But either way, we stay cautious. No lanterns near the cracks. No wandering past the fields. From now on, we keep ourselves hidden. Elena shook her head, her hand stroking Sophia's hair as if to calm herself as much as her daughter. "I told you this place would bring trouble," she said quietly. "Secrets draw eyes. People don't forget stories like the Whitlocks. If they lingered for a reason. The family sat in uneasy silence, the creak of the barn's beams filling the void left by the departing vehicle. Outside, the night seemed darker than before, as though the SUV had stolen the last warmth of the day with it. Daniel placed his hand on the journal resting near the jar of coins, his thumb brushing the cracked leather. He felt the pull of Whitlock's words stronger than ever, but now they were weighed against a very real threat of strangers in the night. Mateo broke the silence first, his voice steady but low. "If they come back, we'll know what they want." Daniel met his son's eyes and saw the same fire there that burned in him, the same unwillingness to walk away. But he also saw the shadow of danger pressing closer, danger that might not wait for them to solve the barn's mysteries before showing its face. That night, no one slept easily. Every creak of the boards, every groan of the timbers sounded like footsteps outside. Elena prayed quietly beneath her breath. Sophia curled against her. Mateo lay in the loft with his eyes open, watching the locked chest as though it might protect him. Daniel remained awake the longest, his gaze fixed on the cracks in the wall, where the light of headlights had shone. The barn felt less like a refuge now, more like a beacon, and someone out there had noticed. The town sat 10 miles from the barn, a place Daniel visited only when necessity forced his hand. That morning, the family had nothing left but crumbs in the bottom of a paper sack, and even Elena could not argue against making the trip. The walk was long and cold, the fields bare around them, the creek whispering faintly in the distance as though it followed their every step. Sophia clung to her mother's hand, her stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm, while Mateo walked ahead, restless and quiet. Daniel carried the duffel, its weight light with want, and tried not to let his children see the lines of worry deepening on his face. The soup kitchen was a small brick building at the edge of town, its windows glowing with the warmth of food and fellowship. They had been here before, though never without hesitation. Daniel disliked the way eyes followed them, measuring their hunger, guessing at their failures. But hunger outweighed pride, and so he pushed the door open and guided his family inside. The room smelled of broth and bread, and steam rose from pots lined against the wall. Volunteers moved briskly, ladling soup into bowls, setting bread onto trays. Daniel stood in line with Elena and the children, trying to shrink into the crowd. Sophia tugged at his coat, whispering about the smell of soup, her eyes wide with longing. He bent low, reassuring her softly, but his attention soon wandered. At the far corner, 2 men sat at a table, their voices low but urgent. Daniel didn't mean to eavesdrop, but their words carried through the room, slipping past the clatter of dishes and the hum of conversation. He caught a name that stiffened his spine. Whitlock. Whitlock land still out there, one man said, his voice rough, his face half hidden under a cap pulled low. The farmhouse burned, but the barn still stands. They say the old man left things behind. Hidden wealth. The other man leaned forward, his tone sharper. I've heard that before. Coins, deeds, maybe even gold. But no one's found it yet, not for lack of trying. He stabbed a piece of bread with a spoon, his eyes narrowing. Someone will, though. Someone always does. Daniel's breath caught in his chest. He kept his eyes forward, forcing himself to look at the volunteers, to shuffle along in line as though nothing had shifted inside him. But the words clung to his ears, louder now, impossible to ignore. Whitlock land, hidden wealth. They weren't just his family's secrets anymore. Others were looking. He accepted the bowls of soup with a murmured thank you, his hands trembling as he carried the tray to a table. Elena noticed immediately, her sharp eyes reading him like an open page. She leaned close as they sat, her voice low. What is it? Daniel shook his head, glancing at Sophia and Mateo, who were too focused on their food to notice. He waited until Elena pressed him again, her hand tightening on his arm. Only then did he speak, his voice nearly a whisper. People are talking. About the Whitlocks. About the barn. Her face hardened, color draining from her cheeks. You're sure? He nodded once. Setting a spoon down, though he had barely touched the soup. I heard them. 2 men in the corner. They know the stories. They know the land still stands. They're looking. Elena's gaze flicked toward the corner, but the men were already rising, their coats pulled tight, their words swallowed by the bustle of the room. She turned back, her eyes burning into him. "I warned you," she hissed. "Secrets don't stay buried. We should leave before." Daniel cut her off with a glance at their children, who ate with quiet hunger, unaware of the storm pressing closer. He leaned forward, his hands clasped tight. "If we leave, we lose everything we found. The journal, the symbols, the coins, they'll take it, and we'll have nothing. This is all we have left. Elena!" Her lips pressed into a thin line, fury and fear warring within her. She wanted to argue, to insist on safety above all else, but she could see the fire in his eyes. He was already too deep in it to turn back. The rest of the meal passed in silence, though Daniel barely tasted his food. The voices of the men replayed in his mind, each word heavier than the last. Others were searching. Others were near. And if they found the barn before he unlocked its secrets, whatever hope it carried for his family would vanish. As they left the soup kitchen and stepped back into the cold evening air, Daniel pulled his coat tighter, his jaw set. Elena walked beside him, her eyes lowered, while Sophia hummed softly, cradling her rabbit, and Mateo kicked at stones, his shoulders squared with restless energy. The town behind them glowed warm, but the road ahead was dark, and in that darkness, Daniel knew eyes might already be watching. The barn was no longer just a shelter. It had become a prize. And now, more than ever, they were not the only ones who wanted what lay hidden within its walls. The morning after their trip to town, Daniel stood outside the barn with the cold air biting at his face. He had not told the children everything he overheard at the soup kitchen, though the worry in Elena's eyes told him she carried the weight of it just as heavily. The barn seemed quieter that day, its timbers groaning less, as if holding its breath. Daniel crouched near the fence line, mending a break in the boards with scraps of wood he had gathered, when the sound of a car engine broke through the stillness. It was not the rumble of an old farm truck or the distant grumble of machinery. This was smooth, steady, deliberate. A black sedan appeared on the road, polished and gleaming despite the dust of the countryside. It slowed as it neared the barn, its tires crunching over the gravel until it came to a stop just beyond the broken fence. The driver's door opened and a man stepped out. He was dressed in a tailored gray suit, his shoes far too fine for the mud and frost. His hair was slicked neatly back, his posture straight and confident. In his hand, he carried a leather briefcase. Daniel rose slowly, his body tense, his hands rough with dirt and calluses. Elena appeared in the barn doorway, instinctively pulling Sophia close while Mateo stepped out behind her, his shoulders squared in silent defiance. The man noticed them all, his gaze sharp, assessing, but when he spoke his voice was smooth, polished with the cadence of someone accustomed to being heard. "Mr. Rivera, is it?" he asked, as though already certain of the answer. Daniel did not confirm, only stared back with guarded silence. The man smiled faintly, undeterred. "My name is Victor Kane. I represent the estate that owns this property, the Whitlock Farm, as it was once known. I thought it best to come in person, given the circumstances." Daniel's brow furrowed. What circumstances? Kane stepped closer, the briefcase swinging lightly at his side. "Your family has been residing here. An understandable choice, given unfortunate situations. But this land, this barn, it isn't yours. It has claimants, legal claimants. And while I sympathize with your hardships, squatting here cannot continue." Elena tightened her grip on Sophia, whispering something in her ear to draw her back inside. Mateo didn't move, his eyes fixed on Kane with a hostility he didn't bother to hide. Daniel said nothing, waiting for the man to finish. Kane's smile widened, practiced and patient. "However," he continued, "I am not without compassion. I am authorized to extend assistance. Monetary aid, if you will, enough to get your family to safer ground, perhaps even start anew. All I ask in return is your immediate departure from the property. Tonight, preferably. Tomorrow at the latest." Daniel's jaw tightened. He had heard this tone before. Men in offices dressed in fine suits speaking in compassion while their hands closed around whatever they truly wanted. He glanced toward the barn, the jar of coins still hidden inside, the journal with its whispers of secrets, the photograph that showed the Whitlocks standing proudly where his family now struggled. Everything in him told him that Kane's offer was not charity, it was strategy. And if I refuse? Daniel asked quietly. Cain tilted his head, as though amused by the question. Then the matter becomes less friendly. Authorities could be involved. Eviction is not pleasant, Mr. Rivera, especially for children. I'd hate to see them frightened by men with badges. Far better for you to accept my help and leave with dignity. Elena stepped forward then, unable to stay silent. Help, she said sharply. You come here in a car worth more than our lives. Speaking of help, when what you want is a barn, you don't fool me. Cain's smile thinned, but he did not drop it entirely. His eyes flicked to her, cool and dismissive, before returning to Daniel. I'll give you time to consider, but not much. He snapped the latches on his briefcase, pulling out a single folded paper and holding it out. My card. Call me when you come to your senses. Daniel didn't move to take it. The paper hung between them until Cain placed it deliberately on the broken fence rail. He adjusted his cufflinks, cast one last look at the barn, then returned his car. The engine purred as he drove away, the sedan disappearing down the road as smoothly as it had arrived. Silence settled again, heavy and suffocating. Elena turned to Daniel, her voice sharp with fear. You see? It's already begun. People know. They'll come until nothing is left for us. Daniel stared at the fence where the card rested, his hands clenched at his sides. He didn't need to read it to know that Cain was lying. This wasn't about squatters or dignity. This was about whatever Whitlock and his brotherhood had hidden. And now it wasn't just the whispers of the past pressing on them. It was a weight of men who lived by law and money, men who would strip the barn bare without hesitation. He turned back toward the barn, his family waiting in its shadows, and felt the decision settle in his chest. Leaving was no longer an option. Whatever the Whitlocks had hidden here, it had become a matter of survival for his family and for the truth buried in the walls. The tension in the barn that night was thicker than the cold air pressing through the cracks. The lantern on the makeshift table flickered weakly, its flames stretching and shrinking with every draft. Sophia lay curled in her blanket near her mother, clutching her rabbit, unaware of the storm rising between her parents. Mateo sat apart, half in shadow on the loft ladder, his gaze moving back and forth between them like he already knew what was coming. Elena's hands trembled as she smoothed the blanket over Sophia. When she finally looked up, her eyes burned with resolve Daniel had seen before, though never this sharp. We need to go, she said firmly, her voice low but carrying in the silence. Tonight, before they come back. Daniel leaned against the beam, arms crossed, the journal resting on the table beside him. His face was hard, worn by exhaustion but lit with the kind of stubborn fire that had carried him through too many hardships to count. We're not leaving, he said flatly. Her eyes widened at the certainty in his tone. Did you not hear him? That man wasn't asking, Daniel. He was warning us. Victor Cain, his suit, his car. He's not a passing stranger. He knows something about this land, and he won't stop until he has it. If we're here when he returns, what happens then? Daniel's jaw tightened, his voice rising for the first time in days. If we leave, Elena, we give him everything. The Whitlock legacy. Whatever is hidden here, whatever could change our lives, we hand it to him without a fight. He stepped closer, his shadow falling across the boards. You saw the coins. You've read the journal. This barn is more than shelter. It's proof that we don't have to wander anymore. Don't you see that? Elena stood, her arms wrapping around herself, though the gesture was more protective than cold. I see my children sleeping on straw. I see Sophia coughing at night. I see Mateo's eyes hollowing because he's old before his time. And I see a man who would rather chase ghosts in the walls than face the truth. Her voice cracked but held steady. This place isn't hope, Daniel. It's a trap. Mateo shifted on the ladder, his eyes flashing between them. His father's conviction sparked something in him, a thrill he couldn't deny. But his mother's words carried the weight of survival. He said nothing, his silence a thread stretched taut between both sides. Daniel's hand fell onto the journal, his fingers tracing the cracked leather as though it were alive. Whitlock wrote of the Brotherhood preparing for collapse. They left symbols, maps, hidden stores. This barn was meant to hold more than animals and tools. It was built to carry something forward, something worth protecting. Why else would men like Cain circle us now? Why else would strangers whisper about the Whitlock land in town? Elena shook her head, her voice breaking into anger. And you think we're the chosen ones to uncover it? That a man who couldn't keep his own family fed on the road is now meant to unlock the secrets of the past? No, Daniel. It's madness. And it will cost us everything. The words cut deep, but he didn't flinch. He had no illusions about the failures that had brought them here, but something in him refused to let this be another defeat. He straightened, his voice steadier, quieter. I won't walk away again. Not from this. Not when the answers are right in front of us. Elena's face crumpled, tore between fury and despair. She pressed her hands to her face for a moment, then lowered them, her voice softer but edged with pain. And what if you're wrong? What if there's nothing but dust and empty promises? What happens when Cain comes back with men who don't care if children are inside? What then, Daniel? The lantern sputtered, its flame shrinking almost to darkness before flaring back to life. The barn groaned under the weight of wind outside, its boards shivering as though echoing their conflict. Mateo finally spoke, his voice low, uncertain. Maybe we can't leave. Not yet. Not until we know for sure what's here. His words hung in the air, neither a solution nor a comfort, but enough to show the divide had spread even to him. Elena turned away, kneeling beside Sophia again, pulling the blanket tighter as if the act itself could shield her daughter from all the dangers pressing closer. Daniel remained by the beam, his hand still resting on the journal, his eyes fixed on the shadows of the barn. No more words passed between them that night, only silence, thick and unforgiving, stretched across the floorboards. One side clung to safety, the other to secrets, and between them stood their children, caught in the fragile balance of a family divided. The morning light came faint through the broken roof, spilling in thin shafts across the barn's floor. Mateo had been awake since before dawn, tossing the loft with a locked chest a few feet from him, its silence gnawing at his patience. The fight between his parents the night before still echoed in his ears, every word sharpening the tension that clung to the air. He knew his father wouldn't leave, and he knew his mother wanted nothing more than to walk away. But he was caught between them, restless with the need to prove that staying meant something. He shifted the old hay aside, searching for distraction, his hands stirring clouds of dust that glittered in the beams of light. The wood beneath him creaked with his weight, but it had learned the rhythm of the boards. Where they groaned deepest, where they sounded hollow. Today, one plank betrayed itself. When he knelt, pressing his hand flat against it, the sound was different. Not solid oak, but something shallow, a muted thump that rang faintly in the silence. He pressed harder, and the board shifted slightly under his weight. His pulse quickened. He brushed the hay aside more furiously, clearing a larger patch until the outline revealed itself. Not random planks, but fitted square, its seams just visible once uncovered. A trapdoor. He sat back on his heels, his breath clouding in the cold air, staring at the discovery as though it might vanish if he blinked. "Papa." His voice cracked, half excitement, half disbelief. Daniel looked up from where he sat with the journal below, his head snapping toward the loft. Elena stiffened instantly, her arms wrapping tighter around Sophia, who stirred sleepily at the noise. "What is it?" Daniel called, already climbing the ladder before Mateo could answer. His son pointed wordlessly, his hand trembling with urgency. Daniel knelt, running his fingers along the edges. The seams were clear, though hidden well enough that only restless hands and curiosity could have revealed them. He pressed down. The wood groaned but held. "Help me clear it," he told Mateo, his voice low. Together they scraped the hay aside, piling it high in the corner until the square would lay bare. Daniel found an old iron hook among the debris below and wedged it into the crack, prying with all his weight. The wood resisted, as though it had been nailed shut by men determined never to let open again. Then, with a long, reluctant creak, it gave way. Dust billowed into the loft as the door lifted, revealing a yawning black mouth beneath. The space below was stone, not wood. Daniel lowered the lantern carefully, its weak flame barely illuminating the darkness. Steps descended into ground, carved roughly but with purpose, leading to a cellar that no one had spoken of in Whitlock's journal. The air that rose from it was damp and cold, carrying the scent of earth and stone untouched for generations. Elena's voice rang sharp from below. "Close it. Don't you dare go down there." Her fear trembled in the rafters, but Daniel didn't move. He and Mateo knelt side by side, staring into the darkness as though it had called to them by name. "This shouldn't be here," Daniel murmured, his voice more reverent than surprised. "There's no mention of a cellar. Not once." Mateo's eyes gleamed in the lantern light. "Then this is where they hid it, whatever it is." His words carried both awe and triumph, the certainty of a boy who needed a mystery to be real. Daniel leaned closer, his hand gripping the edge of the trapdoor. The steps seemed to descend farther than they should, deeper than any simple storage pit. The walls were stone, fitted carefully, not the crude work of a farmer, but something more deliberate, almost ritualistic. He imagined men moving by lantern light long ago, carrying jars, crates, and papers, sealing them beneath the barn to wait for another age. Elena climbed halfway up the ladder, her face pale, her eyes hard with fear. "Daniel," she said, her voice shaking, "close it now. Whatever is down there was meant to stay buried. Can't you see that? It's not for us." But Daniel couldn't look away. Neither could Mateo. The barn had whispered to them before, through symbols, through photographs, through a jar of coins hidden in a beam. Now it had opened its mouth entirely, revealing something deeper, something built to last. He glanced at his son, and in Mateo's expression, he saw the reflection of his own determination. "Not tonight," Daniel said finally, lowering the trapdoor back into place. "It's too dark, too cold, but soon." His voice was steady, a decision already made. He slid the iron hook free and pressed the hay back across the seams, hiding the door once more. Elena climbed back down, her silence heavy with anger and fear. Sophia, awake now, clung to her mother's side, her eyes wide with confusion. Mateo lingered over the hidden square, his heart pounding with the thrill of discovery. The trapdoor remained covered, but its presence pressed against them all like a heartbeat beneath the floor. The barn had given up another secret, and none of them could pretend life inside its walls would ever be the same. The trapdoor groaned as Daniel and Mateo pushed it open again, the hinges shrieking in protest, as though the wood itself wished to remain sealed. The lantern flickered in Daniel's hand, its glow spilling across the rough stone steps that descended into darkness. Elena stood near the ladder, her arms locked tightly around Sophia, her voice tight with warning. "Don't," she whispered. But neither father nor son turned back. The pull of the hidden cellar was stronger than fear, stronger than doubt. They moved slowly, each step stirring echoes that had not been heard in decades. The air grew colder as they descended, dampness clinging to their skin. The stone walls pressed close, their surfaces rough yet deliberate, as though laid with care by men who intended them to endure. The lantern's light lit the walls, revealing faint grooves that at first looked like cracks. But when Mateo leaned closer, brushing away the dust with his fingers, his breath caught. "Papa," he whispered, pointing. Carvings stretched across the walls, their lines etched deeply into the stone. At first they seemed abstract, spirals, arrows, intersecting triangles. But as Daniel moved the lantern slowly, the images sharpened into patterns with meaning. One wall bore the outline of the fields they knew above, marked with careful lines showing fences and streams long since vanished from the land. Hollow Creek ran like a silver thread across the carving, just as it did outside, and the shape of the barn itself was marked at the center. It was a map. Daniel's hand tightened on the lantern, his heart pounding as he traced the familiar shapes. The Whitlocks had carved their land here, underground, preserving it against time. But this was no simple surveyor's drawing. Symbols marked the map, each one carved with intention. Near the fields was a sheaf of grain, lines radiating from it like the sun. Beneath the image, faint words still clung, nourishment. Mateo's voice trembled, not from fear, but from awe. They marked what they wanted to save. He moved along the wall, his hand brushing another symbol, a book etched with deliberate lines, its spine clear even in the dim light. Beneath it was the word knowledge. Further along, carved higher into the stone, was a cross enclosed in a circle. Beneath it, faith. Daniel's breath came slow, reverent. These weren't just farmers, he murmured. They were building something bigger. They wanted to keep more than food or money. They wanted to keep everything that defined them. The carvings continued around the cellar, a cluster of jars marked with circles, provisions sealed away for years, a small anvil, labor and craft, a pair of clasped hands, brotherhood. Each carving seemed to weave a story of what the Whitlocks valued most, the essence of their lives carved into stone to outlast ruin. Mateo's eyes glowed in the lantern light. It's like a map of their whole world, he said. Like they knew it would all fall apart and wanted someone to remember. Daniel swallowed hard, his gaze fixed on the barn symbol carved at the center of it all. And they chose this place, he said. Not the house, not the town. The barn. This was the heart of it. Behind them, Elena's voice carried down, strained and sharp. Enough. Come back up. She stood at the trapdoor's edge, her silhouette rigid against the lantern's glow. Her fear was palpable, but her words could not break the spell the carvings had woven. Daniel raised the lantern higher, sweeping its glow across the ceiling of the cellar. More symbols stretched there, overlapping, almost like constellations. Stars, suns, circles. The language of men who had lived with the rhythm of earth and sky, trying to capture permanence in a world they feared would crumble. For a long time, neither father nor son spoke. The silence of the cellar seemed to press on their shoulders, heavy with the weight of memory. Mateo finally broke it, his voice hushed but steady. We have to see where it leads. The map, it's telling us what's still here. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, hearing Elena's warning above, feeling the pull of both fear and wonder. Then he opened them again, fixing his gaze on the carved barn at the center of the stone wall. His voice was quiet but certain. This place isn't just shelter. It's inheritance. The Whitlocks left it for whoever would listen. They climbed back up the steps at last, the lantern flickering as it caught the damp air. When the trapdoor shut behind them, the barn felt heavier, its silence filled with all they had seen below. Elena drew Sophia close, her eyes searching Daniel's face for answers he could not give. But in his expression, she saw something that terrified her more than Cain's threats or the whispers in town. Conviction. The cellar had spoken through stone, and Daniel had heard it. The barn was no longer just a refuge from cold nights. It was a vault, a message, a map carved by hands long gone, waiting for those willing to risk everything to uncover what still lay hidden. The cellar had not left Daniel's mind since he and Mateo had first seen the carvings etched into the stone. Every night afterward, as Elena held Sophia close and whispered her quiet prayers, Daniel would find himself glancing toward the loft, toward the trapdoor that hid the steps leading downward. It pulled at him like a weight on his chest, each creak of the barn reminding him of what they had glimpsed in the lantern's glow. He told himself to wait, to respect Elena's fear, but when the opportunity came, he could not ignore it. It was Mateo who discovered it. The boy had returned to the cellar alone at dawn, his hands itching with the need to prove himself useful, to uncover what the Whitlocks had left. Daniel found him later, dust on his clothes, his eyes alive with excitement. There's another one, he said, his words tumbling quickly. Another book. It was behind one of the stones. They descended together, the lantern swaying in Daniel's grip. The cellar seemed different now, less ominous, more purposeful, as though it welcomed them back. Mateo led him to the far wall, where a loose stone jutted just enough to catch the eye. With careful effort, they pried it free. Behind it lay a cavity wrapped in darkness. Mateo reached inside and pulled out a bundle sealed in cloth, stiff with age. Daniel brushed the dirt away and unwrapped it. Another journal. The leather cover was darker than the first, its surface scarred and cracking. The binding groaned as Daniel opened it, the pages fragile but intact, filled with the same careful handwriting he had come to recognize. He turned the first page, and there it was again, Thomas Whitlock's name, followed by the date, 1873. The entries were longer, more frantic, the words carrying the urgency of a man riding on the edge of collapse. He read aloud while Mateo held the lantern close. The panic spreads. Banks close their doors. Men lose everything overnight. Neighbors flee their land, leaving fields to rot. The children ask why the world trembles, and I have no answer that eases them. Daniel paused, the weight of the words sinking heavily in the still air. He continued, "I tell them we must endure. We must protect what matters, not for ourselves but for those who will come after. So we place it within the barn, the strong heart of this land, where stone and wood will guard what paper and coin cannot." The entries painted a picture of fear and resilience. The Whitlocks had not abandoned their farm lightly. The panic of 1873 had torn through their lives, stripping families of savings, land, and hope. Thomas wrote of neighbors forced to sell for pennies, of strangers riding through with papers that claimed everything in sight. He feared the collapse was not just financial but moral, a corruption that would swallow their way of life. And so they had hidden it, their legacy, as he called it. Provisions sealed in jars, coins stashed in beams, deeds and papers placed in secret compartments. The barn was their vault, the cellar their sanctuary, meant to survive the storms that raged above ground. One entry described the night they left. The fear of torches on the horizon, the urgency of sealing the trapdoor before dawn. "We depart with heavy hearts," it read, "but the barn remains. Within its walls rests what we were, and perhaps what we will be again." Daniel closed the journal slowly, his thumb pressed against the page as though reluctant to let it go. His mind churned with questions. What exactly had they left? How much remained undiscovered? And why, if they fled, had no one spoken of their return? Mateo's eyes burned with restless energy. "See? They meant for someone to find it. It's not just coins or food. It's more. It has to be." Daniel nodded, though his agreement was not just excitement but conviction. He could feel the weight of Whitlock's words pressing into him, a responsibility that seemed to settle on his shoulders. He imagined the farmer and his family sealing the journal in stone, whispering promises to the walls that time would not erase. When they climbed back into the barn, Elena stood waiting near the ladder, her face pale. She looked at the journal in Daniel's hands and knew immediately what it was. "Another one," she whispered, almost to herself. Her eyes closed briefly, as though each discovery pulled her further from the hope of escape. Daniel placed the journal on the plank table beside the first, the two volumes lying like anchors of history. He rested his hand on them, his voice quiet but unshaken. They didn't just live here. They prepared this place to outlast themselves. And now it's ours to decide what to do with it. Elena said nothing. She gathered Sophia into her arms and turned away, unwilling to meet his gaze. The barn silence deepened around them, but for Daniel it no longer felt like emptiness. It felt like a story that was still speaking, a voice that demanded to be heard. The second journal lay open in the dim light, its words whispering of collapse, of departure, of legacy hidden in plain sight. Daniel could not ignore it. Not now. The Whitlocks had fled, but they had left behind more than just stone and wood. They had left behind a charge, one that had now fallen into his hands. The sky was the color of slate when the sound of tires on gravel returned. The family had grown accustomed to the groans of the barn, the whistle of the creek, even the occasional howl of a distant dog across the fields. But the low hum of an engine sent an entirely different chill through the boards. Daniel had been mending a broken section of the loft ladder when he froze, his head lifting sharply. Elena's face paled immediately, her arms instinctively tightening around Sophia, while Mateo bolted the gap in the wall to peer out. The black SUV came into view, its polished surface almost obscene against the worn landscape. It slowed, then stopped at the fence, the same place as before. But this time there was no hesitation. The driver's door opened with a deliberate swing, and Victor Kane stepped out. His suit was as immaculate as the last time, his hair combed neatly, his briefcase in hand. Yet there was something different in the way he carried himself. Gone was a polite veneer of a man offering help. His strides were faster, sharper, and his eyes held a glint that made Daniel's stomach knot. Kane didn't pause at the fence. He pushed through the broken section and crossed the field, his shoes sinking slightly in the frost-hardened ground. When he reached the barn, he stopped only to smooth his tie before rapping firmly on the weathered door. The knock reverberated through the boards, loud and commanding like a judge's gavel. "Mr. Rivera," Kane called, his voice smooth but edged with impatience. "We need to speak. Now!" Elena whispered sharply to Daniel, her voice quivering with both fear and fury. "Don't open it. Don't you dare." Sophia clung to her mother's dress, her eyes wide, her rabbit pressed against her chest. But Cain did not wait for an answer. He pressed his hand flat against the door and pushed it slightly inward, peering through the gap as though the barn already belonged to him. Daniel stepped forward, placing himself between the door and his family. "You can't be here," Daniel said firmly, his voice low but steady. Cain smiled thinly, his teeth glinting in the dim light. "On the contrary, Mr. Rivera, I can, and I will. This property is not yours, and I have every legal right to inspect it. But I thought I'd extend you the courtesy of cooperation before involving the county." Daniel's jaw tightened. "We're not leaving." Cain's eyes flicked past him, sweeping the barn's interior, lingering for the briefest moment on the loft above. When he spoke again, his tone carried a new edge, sharper than law, heavier than civility. "Then you've already found something." The words landed like stones in silence. Elena stiffened, pulling Sophia back further into the shadows. Mateo gripped the rail of the loft ladder, his knuckles white. Daniel didn't move, though his pulse roared in his ears. Cain's certainty revealed more than he intended. He knew. Not guessed, not suspected. Knew. Cain stepped closer, lowering his voice, each word deliberate. "Listen to me. Men before you have searched this barn. Most found nothing. But I know what lies beneath. The Whitlocks were not farmers alone. They were custodians. They left something here, and it does not belong to you." He adjusted his cufflinks, his composure returning in a sheen of arrogance. "Hand it over, Mr. Rivera, and I will make this simple for you. Resist, and I assure you, simplicity will vanish." Daniel held his ground, though every muscle in his body wanted to lash out. "This barn is our home now," he said quietly. "Whatever is here is not yours either." For the first time, Cain's smile faltered. His jaw twitched, his massive patience cracking. "You don't understand the forces you're meddling with. This isn't about shelter. It's about legacy. And you, squatting here with scraps, cannot possibly protect it." He turned sharply, his shoes striking the dirt floor, pacing a few steps before stopping again. His hand lingered on the edge of the doorframe, his eyes narrowing as though he were calculating how much longer he needed to pretend its civility. "I'll return soon," he said finally, his voice cold. "And when I do, I won't be alone." With that, he stepped back out into the fading light, crossed the field without another word, and climbed into his waiting SUV. The engine roared to life, and the vehicle rolled away, leaving the barn in silence once more. Inside, Elena's voice broke through the heavy air. "You see?" she hissed, her eyes wet with fear. "He knows. He'll come back with others. We won't stand a chance." Daniel turned toward her, his face etched with resolve even as dread churned in his stomach. "All the more reason we can't leave," he said. His hand tightened on the beam beside him, the weight of the journals heavy in his thoughts. "Whatever is hidden here was meant to be found by those who endure. That's us now, not him." Mateo's eyes gleamed from the loft, fire burning in his expression. Elena pulled Sophia close, her silence heavier than words. The barn seemed to shudder with the echo of Cain's knock, its walls holding the weight of secrets that could no longer remain hidden. And though night soon fell across the fields, none of them slept, for they knew the storm was not far behind. The night was still, the fields outside blanketed in frost that shimmered faintly under the moon. Inside the barn, the family had tried to rest, but rest never truly came anymore. Every creak of wood, every sigh of wind to the gaps and boards felt like footsteps, like whispers announcing that Cain would return. Daniel sat with his back against the beam, the journal stacked close by, his head bowed as though he could wrestle certainty from their pages. Mateo lingered in the loft, his eyes never leaving the trapdoor that concealed the cellar, while Sophia clung to her rabbit and drifted in and out of uneasy dreams. Elena, who once longed to flee from this place, could not sleep either. She had resisted Daniel's faith in the barn's secrets, feared the weight of what it carried, and begged him to leave before it crushed them. Yet something had shifted since Cain's last visit. The way he had spoken, his confidence, his threats, lit a fire in her that even fear could not extinguish. She could no longer afford to be the one who only urged retreat. If Cain meant to break into their refuge, then someone had to stand between him and her children. She decided it would be her. It was well past midnight when the sound came, the faint crunch of tires on gravel, muted but unmistakable. Elena's head lifted instantly, her body tensing as though the noise had been waiting in her veins. Daniel stirred, Mateo froze, and Sophia whimpered softly in her sleep. Then came another sound, the slow, deliberate slam of a car door. Elena rose before Daniel could move. She pulled Sophia's blanket tighter, whispered to Mateo to stay still, then stepped toward the barn doors. Her steps were silent but sure, her hands balled into fists at her sides. Through the thin seam of the board, she saw it. The black SUV again, parked nearer than before, its headlights extinguished. The night swallowed the vehicle whole, but she could feel Kane's presence in the shadows. Then came the voice, low and cold. "Mr. Rivera, I know you're inside." Daniel started to rise, but Elena cut him off with a sharp look. "No," she whispered. "Not you." For the first time since they had come to the barn, it was not Daniel who stepped forward. It was Elena. The latch rattled as Kane's hand pressed against the door, testing it. Elena placed her palm flat against the rough wood, her heart pounding, but her voice steady. "You have no right here." There was silence on the other side, then a quiet chuckle. "Mrs. Rivera," Kane said smoothly, "I admire your courage, but let's not pretend. This place isn't yours. Open the door and let me see what you found, and I promise your children will be spared the ugliness that follows." Her hand tightened against the wood, nails digging into the grain. "You'll not set foot inside while my children sleep here." The word surprised even Daniel. Her tone was iron, sharp enough to slice the silence. Kane's voice grew sharper in reply. "Do you think you can keep me out forever? I will have what lies beneath this barn. You cannot stop me." Elena lifted her chin, though he could not see it. "Then come with your men and show them you threaten children in the dark. Show them the kind of man who hides behind lawyers and cars. But tonight you leave." For the first time, Kane's composure cracked. There was a pause, longer this time, his breath audible through the seams of the door. Then came a hiss, low and venomous. "You have no idea what you're protecting." Elena pressed her forehead briefly to the wood, her voice soft but resolute. "I know enough, and I know it won't belong to you." There was a shift outside, the sound of shoes scraping on frost, the faint click of the SUV's door opening again. Kane lingered for a heartbeat, then the engine roared to life, shattering the quiet. The vehicle reversed sharply, gravel scattering under its tires, before it sped away into the night, its growl fading across the empty fields. Elena stayed at the door long after the sound was gone, her body trembling now that the moment had passed. When she turned, Daniel was staring at her, the journal forgotten at his side. Mateo's eyes were wide, filled not with fear but with admiration, while Sophia stirred softly in her sleep, untouched by what transpired. Elena walked back to them, her breath uneven but her steps steady. She pulled Sophia into her arms, smoothing her daughter's hair, then met Daniel's gaze. "If we stay," she whispered, "then we stay together. No more secrets between us. No more silence. If Kane comes again, he'll find me waiting." The barn creaked as the wind swept through the cracks, but sound felt different now. Less like fear, more like affirmation. Elena, once the voice of retreat, had drawn a line in the dark, and in that moment, she became the shield her family needed. The morning after Kane's visit, the barn felt different. The tension of the night still clung to the beams, yet there was a new steadiness in the air. Elena moved about with a kind of quiet resolve, her eyes sharper, her presence stronger. Daniel noticed it, but said nothing. The children, though still shaken, looked at their mother with a new kind of assurance, as though they sensed a change too. The journals remained on the plank table, their cracked leather spines waiting like old voices. But Daniel knew they were no longer just relics. They were instructions, and so he returned to them, tracing the words that hinted at what still remained hidden within the barn. It was Mateo who uncovered the next secret. He had grown restless again, prowling the edges of the walls as though he could feel the history humming behind the wood. In one corner, where the boards met stone, he tapped and heard a sound different from the rest. Not the solid echo of wood, but a muted thud, as though space lay just beyond. He crouched, prying gently with his fingers until a section of planking shifted. Dust rained down, and the smell of earth rushed into the barn. "Papa," he called, his voice thick with excitement. Daniel was at his side in seconds, running his hands over the loose boards. With a firm pull, one gave way, revealing a cavity just wide enough for storage. Daniel reached in cautiously, his fingers brushing against something smooth and cold. When he drew it out, the family gathered close. It was a metal container, sealed tight, its surface tarnished but unbroken. A second, then a third followed, each one nearly identical, packed tightly into the hidden compartment. Daniel placed them on the floor, his hands trembling as he worked at the first lid. It gave a reluctant pop, and when he peered inside, his breath caught. Small packets filled the container, each wrapped in wax paper, their edges brown but intact. Faded handwriting scrawled across them in neat script. Corn, wheat, barley, beans, squash. He lifted one carefully, the word tomatoes barely legible through the years. Elena's hand flew to her mouth. "Seeds," she whispered. Daniel's throat tightened. Not just seeds. Heirloom. Whitlock's words. Nourishment. This is what he meant. Mateo bent low, his eyes wide. They saved food for the future. Elena knelt beside them, running her fingers lightly across the waxy packets as though afraid they might crumble. "They prepared for famine," she murmured, "for a world without harvest." Her voice wavered with both awe and unease. They thought so far ahead. Daniel lifted another packet, holding it carefully to the light filtering through the cracks above. "These could still grow," he said quietly. "If they were sealed right, they could last generations." He closed his eyes for a moment, imagining fields of grain rising again from the very land where the Whitlocks had once toiled, imagining the power of feeding a family, a town, from seeds long thought lost. Sophia, sleepy-eyed but curious, crawled closer and touched one of the containers with her small hand. "It's like treasure," she whispered. "Treasure you plant." Her words settled over them like truth. This was no gold, no currency, but something older and more powerful. Life preserved against hunger. The Whitlocks had not only hidden wealth in coins or papers, they had hidden survival itself. Elena looked at Daniel then, her fear tempered by something else. This is why Cain is here. Not just for money, not just for stories. He knows what this place holds. Daniel nodded slowly, his jaw set. "And now so do we." They sealed the containers again, stacking them carefully back into the hollow wall, hiding them beneath loose boards and fresh straw. Daniel lingered a moment, his hand pressed against the wood. The barn groaned as if in acknowledgement, its secrets yielding one by one. When the family sat together that evening, the lanterns glowed soft against the boards. The containers of seeds seemed to rest between them like an unspoken promise. Elena's hands wrapped around Sophia's shoulders. Mateo sat straighter, and Daniel kept his palm on the journals. They were no longer simply surviving from one night to the next. They had stumbled into a legacy meant to endure famine, collapse, and time itself. The chamber of seeds had revealed itself, and with it came the realization that the Whitlocks had built more than a refuge. They had built a future, sealed into walls and stone, waiting for someone desperate enough and brave enough to uncover it. The discovery of the seeds lingered in their minds for days, but the barn had not yet finished speaking. The journals had hinted at wealth hidden in plain sight, not only in food and provisions, but in things that would carry value long after the Whitlocks had vanished. Daniel could not shake the feeling that they had only brushed the surface. Each time he traced the carvings on the cellar walls, his eyes fell on the symbol etched like a scroll, the faint word beneath it, knowledge. He knew it was no accident. The Whitlocks had placed more than seeds into hiding. They had sealed away the record of their fortune. One cold afternoon, Daniel and Mateo descended the cellar steps again, their lantern casting long shadows across the stone. Elena remained above, restless and protective of Sophia, yet unable to stop them. The cellar smelled of damp earth and old stone, its silence heavy, the carving seeming to lean closer with every visit. Daniel crouched near one wall, his fingers tapping gently against the mortar until a section of stone gave off a hollow sound. He and Mateo worked at it, prying carefully until another cavity revealed itself. Inside was not a small compartment, but a shallow recess filled with wooden crates, their surfaces blackened with time. Dust clung thick, and cobwebs stretched across the corners, as if the earth itself had tried to weave them back into silence. With effort, they dragged one crate into the lantern's glow, the wood creaking under its own weight. Mateo's heart pounded as he wedged a crowbar into the lid and forced it open. Papers lay inside, stacked neatly despite the years. Their edges were yellowed, their ink faded but still legible. Daniel lifted the first bundle with careful hands. The heading across the top made his breath catch. Certificate of stock. Beneath it was the name of a railroad company long since absorbed into history, dated 1871. He flipped to another. Shares in a mining operation in Nevada. Bold signatures scrawled in ink that had survived a century underground. Another bundle held land deeds, each describing parcels across Vermont and beyond, signed with seals of authenticity. Mateo's eyes widened. These are money? Daniel shook his head slowly, a weight settling over him. Not money, but power, investments, ownership. He turned another page, revealing shares in an iron company, then a copper mine, then a deed marked with the Whitlock name. His voice dropped lower, reverent. This was their wealth. This is what they protected. They opened another crate. Inside were ledgers bound in leather, filled with neat columns of numbers and transactions, names of companies he had only heard in passing, names that had built cities, railroads, and industries. Some had collapsed in the panic Whitlock described. Others had endured. Daniel knew enough to recognize that if even a fraction of these documents retained value, they represented more than treasure. They were legacy, tied to the bones of the nation itself. Mateo leaned closer, his hands trembling as he lifted one deed. If this is real, Papa were rich. Daniel placed a hand on his son's shoulder, steadying him. If it's real, then it's dangerous, he said quietly. Men like Cain don't chase barns for scraps. He knows about this, or enough to suspect. The lantern flame flickered, sending their shadows across the stone walls, the carvings glowing faintly in the light. Daniel thought of the Whitlocks, sitting by lamplight in the same cellar, deciding what to hide, what to preserve. They had seen collapse not as an end, but as a storm to outlast, and these crates were their ark. They replaced the documents carefully, covering the crates once more with stones and straw. Daniel pressed his palm against the cold wall, the faint moisture seeping into his skin. He felt the responsibility sink deeper into him. The Whitlocks had trusted their legacy to the barn, and now that trust had passed his family. When they climbed back into the barn, Elena was waiting, her eyes sharp with worry. Daniel set the lantern down and met her gaze. They left more than seeds, he said softly. They left fortune. Her breath caught, and for a moment silence hung between them all, broken only by Sophia's quiet humming with her rabbit in her arms. The barn's boards creaked under the weight of the truth, and though the world outside remained cold and hostile, inside they knew what they had uncovered was not just survival, but power that men like Cain would do anything to seize. The days after the crates were uncovered fell heavier, as though the barn itself carried their discoveries in its beams. The journals rested on the table beside the jar of coins, the seed containers carefully hidden once more in a hollow wall, and the deeds and stock certificates sealed back in the cellar beneath stone. Daniel could feel the weight of it all pressing on him each time he looked at his family. The Whitlocks had left more than relics. They had left a test, a labyrinth of survival and fortune carved into wood and stone. And yet, for all his determination, it was not he or Mateo who uncovered the next secret. It was Sophia. She had taken to sitting quietly with scraps of paper, drawing while the others worked. Daniel had scavenged half-burnt notebooks from the ruins of the farmhouse, their pages singed but still usable, and given them to her with a pencil stub. What began as simple sketches of the barn, and the field soon became something else. She had a way of looking at the carvings on the walls, of tilting her head as though listening, and then recreating them with a precision that startled Daniel when he first saw. One evening, as the lantern flickered and the coal pressed deeper into the cracks, Sophia laid her drawings out across the floor. Daniel crouched beside her, curious, while Elena watched warily from the shadows. The pages were covered with spirals, triangles, crosses, and circles, symbols that matched those carved into beams and stone below. But Sophia had arranged them in a way that seemed deliberate, lines connecting one to another, arrows pointing between them. "See," she whispered, tapping with her small finger. They fit together like pieces of a picture. Daniel frowned, leaning closer. What he had taken as scattered carvings, random markers of Brotherhood rituals, his daughter had woven into a single map. One page showed the spiral with a cross, another the grain sheaf labeled nourishment, another the bookmarked knowledge. In her sketches, she had drawn lines that mirrored the actual placement of each symbol in the barn, linking them across walls and beams. When he followed the trail with his eyes, it led not to the cellar, not to the loft, but to a blank corner near the farthest stall. Mateo dropped down from the loft, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the drawings. "She's right," he said quickly. "It's not random." They were leaving directions. Elena shook her head, her voice strained. "She's a child, Daniel. She draws what she sees. Don't put the weight of these secrets on her." But Daniel's hand trembled as he traced a path across the paper. "Sometimes it takes a child to see what we overlook," he murmured. He lifted his gaze to Sophia, who watched him with quiet certainty. Her rabbit clutched under her arm. "Where does it end?" She tapped the final page, where she had drawn a faint rectangle, shaded darker than the rest. "Here," she said simply, "behind the boards where it doesn't match." They moved as one, lantern in hand, crossing the barn to the farthest stall. Dust thickened in the air, the boards groaning as if warning them back. Daniel crouched where Sophia pointed. The wood there was slightly different, the grain smoother, the nails hammered in a straighter line. He tapped it, and the sound echoed hollow. Mateo was already pulling at the boards, prying with rusted iron bar until one came loose with a sharp crack. Behind it was not empty space, but another cavity, sealed tight with plaster and brick. Daniel's chest tightened. He scraped at the surface with the edge of the crowbar until it gave way, the lantern's glow spilling into the hollow. Something lay within, wrapped in oilcloth darkened by age. He reached in, his hand steady though his heart pounded, and pulled it free. The bundle was heavier than he expected. He unwrapped it slowly, the cloth flaking under his touch, and revealed a chest no larger than a bread box. Its lid bore the same spiral with cross symbol Sophia had drawn, etched faintly into the wood. The lock was simple, rusted through. Mateo pried it open with a grunt, and the lid creaked back. Inside were more documents, bound in leather, but also a bundle of envelopes sealed with wax, their edges pristine despite the years. Beneath them, tucked carefully, were ledgers and diagrams that seemed to detail not only what the Whitlocks had hidden but why. Daniel lifted one page, his eyes scanning the faded ink. It was a list of names, companies, and numbers, but it was a final line that froze him. Asterisk, the vault is complete. Let those who come after find it, for faith, for nourishment, for knowledge. Asterisk. Elena stood in the shadows, her face pale but her eyes locked on the chest. Sophia tugged at her sleeve, holding out the sketch. "See, Mama, it wasn't just drawings. It was their map." Elena gathered her daughter close, her voice breaking with both fear and pride. "Yes, me, Nina. You saw what we could not." The barn seemed to hold its breath around them, the discovery heavier than all the others. What the Whitlocks had left was no longer a question of scraps or survival. It was legacy, bound in diagrams, deeds, and the certainty of a plan that had spanned generations. And it was Sophia, the quiet child with pencil and paper, who had shown them the way. The barn seemed to hold its silence differently after Sophia's discovery. The small chest with its maps and envelopes had confirmed that the Whitlocks had not acted out of superstition or whim, but with purpose, with design. Daniel could feel the walls pressing closer, urging them onward, as though the barn itself knew there was one last secret waiting to be unearthed. He could not ignore it, and neither could Mateo, whose restless energy had only sharpened since the night they pried open the hollow behind the stall. Even Elena, though wary and watchful, no longer tried to stop them outright. She had seen too much already, and her hands, though protective of the children, trembled less when she spoke of leaving. Some part of her had accepted that the barn was not finished speaking. It was late afternoon when they returned to the cellar, the lantern swaying in Daniel's grip, its light painting the stone walls in uneven patches. The carvings seemed to shift in the glow, their symbols almost alive, and the air smelled of earth and iron. Daniel's eyes kept drifting to a section near the far corner where the stones looked heavier, layered differently than the rest. He had noticed it before but dismissed it, thinking it reinforcement. Now, with the weight of the journals and Sophia's sketches guiding him, he felt certain. The Whitlocks had built something more than storage here. Mateo pressed his ear to the wall and knocked. The sound came back muted, hollow in a way that sent shivers across his skin. "It's here," he said, his voice tight with certainty. Without waiting, he jammed the crowbar into the seam between two stones and pulled. Dust fell in thick sheets, and the scrape of iron against mortar filled the cellar. Daniel joined him, working in steady rhythm, prying stone after stone until the shape of a cavity emerged. Elena's voice drifted faintly from above, warning them not to push too far. But neither man nor boy paused. When the last stone gave way, a gap opened large enough to see inside. The lantern light spilled into it, illuminating a box pushed back into the darkness. It was large, iron-bound, its surface blackened with age but still intact. A heavy lock clung to its latch, rusted but unbroken. Daniel's breath caught. "A chest," he whispered. They dragged it out together, their muscles straining against the weight. The scrape of metal across stone rang like an echo from another time, as though the Whitlocks themselves stirred at the sound. The chest was solid, built to endure, its corners bound in iron, its lid reinforced with bands that had resisted both rot and rust. The lock gave way after several hard strikes from the crowbar, shattering with a dull snap. For a long moment, no one moved. Daniel's hand hovered over the lid, the lantern trembling faintly in his other grip. Then, with a deep breath, he pushed it open. The glow of the lantern struck gold first. Dozens of coins lay stacked within, their surfaces dull by age but still gleaming faintly. Beneath them, nestled in cloth, were bars of silver, their weighty shapes unmistakable even in shadow. Mateo gasped, his eyes wide, his hand reaching instinctively before Daniel stopped him. "Careful," he said, his voice low. But it was not only wealth that the chest held. Beneath the precious metal, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with wax, lay bundles of paper. Daniel lifted one carefully, the wax cracking under his touch. Inside were handwritten documents, the ink faded but still clear. They were trusts, wills, agreements drafted in Whitlock's hand. Words leapt out at him. Heirs, guardianship, stewardship. These were not the scribbles of desperate men, but the organized plans of a family determined to preserve what they had built. Elena had descended the steps now, drawn by the sound of stone and metal. She stood at the edge of the lantern's glow, her hand on Sophia's shoulder, her eyes fixed on the open chest. She said nothing at first, only stared at the gold, the silver, the paper spread in Daniel's hands. When she finally spoke, her voice carried both awe and sorrow. "This is why they burned. This is what men will kill for." Daniel looked up at her, his hands still holding the trust documents. "This isn't just fortune," he said. "It's a legacy. They meant for someone to carry it forward. Maybe they meant for family. Maybe for anyone desperate enough to survive." Mateo's voice was a whisper, trembling with awe. "It's real, Papa. All of it." Sophia clutched her rabbit tighter, her eyes fixed on the chest. "They left it safe," she said softly, almost as though speaking to the Whitlocks themselves, "so we could find it when we needed it." The lantern light flickered, casting shadows across the gold and silver, the symbols on the walls seeming to watch from every side. Daniel replaced the papers gently, closing the lid partway, though he could not bring himself to seal it again. He felt the weight of what they had uncovered pressing into him. Not just the metal, not just the fortune, but the responsibility of it. Cain would come again, and others with him. Men who would strip the barn bare and destroy what the Whitlocks had guarded for generations. As the chest sat between them, the family knew the barn had revealed its heart. Within its walls, beneath its stones, the Whitlocks had left a treasure of wealth and intention, a golden chest that bound the past to the present. And now, whether they wanted it or not, the Riveras were the keepers of it. The morning was gray and brittle, the kind of cold that seemed to hollow out the bones. The family ate little, each of them listening more than speaking, waiting for a sound they knew would come. The golden chest sat hidden again beneath the cellar stones, the weight of it pressing against their thoughts like a silent heartbeat. Daniel checked the boards at the door twice, then a third time, though he knew they would do little against the man they expected. Elena sat with Sophia in her lap, stroking her hair, her eyes distant but steady. Mateo paced like a caged animal, restless energy twitching through his shoulders. It was just past noon when the rumble of engines cut across the fields. Not one, but several. The sound grew until the first black SUV crested the rise of the road, followed by a second, then a truck with tinted windows. Gravel scattered as they turned sharply into the lane, stopping with deliberate force near the broken fence. Doors swung open in unison. Kane stepped out first, his suit immaculate, his expression tight with purpose. Behind him, 4 men followed, broad-shouldered, coats heavy, their silence louder than words. The barn seemed to shrink under the sight of them. Daniel's jaw tightened as he stepped forward, positioning himself in the doorway. Elena rose as well, though she kept Sophia close to her hip. Mateo moved his father's side, fists clenched, his eyes burning with defiance. Kane's shoes crunched against the frost as he crossed the yard, his men following in careful formation. He stopped a few feet from the door, his gaze sweeping the family before landing on Daniel. "Mr. Rivera," he said smoothly, though the veneer of civility was thinner this time. "You forced my hand." Daniel didn't move. "This isn't yours." Kane's smile was brittle, a shard of glass rather than warmth. "You're wrong. This land belongs to interests far greater than you. Whatever is hidden within these walls has never been yours to touch. I gave you a chance to walk away with dignity. Instead, you chose defiance." He motioned with a flick of his hand. One of the men stepped forward, reaching for the barn door. But before he could touch it, Elena's voice cut sharply across the cold air. "You won't set foot inside." Her tone startled even Daniel. She stepped forward, one hand still holding Sophia close, the other pressed firmly against the wood of the door. Her eyes burned, not with fear but with something harder. "This is our home. You want to tear it apart? You'll have to do it in front of everyone." Kane's brow furrowed. "Everyone?" he repeated. It was then that the distant wail of sirens broke through the tension, at first faint, then growing louder, sweeping across the empty fields like a warning. Kane stiffened, his jaw tightening as the sound drew closer. Within minutes, 2 county sheriff's vehicles pulled into the lane, dust and gravel rising in their wake. They stopped hard beside Kane's caravan, doors opening quickly as uniformed officers stepped out, hands resting on their belts. The lead deputy approached, his eyes sharp beneath the brim of his hat. "Afternoon," he said evenly. "We got a call about trespassing." "Property disputes are civil matters, Mr. Kane, not something you handle with a private army." Kane's smile returned, brittle but practiced. "Deputy, I'm here on behalf of legal claimants. This land is contested." The deputy cut him off. "Contested doesn't mean you roll up with 4 men and scare a family off the shelter. You know better." His hand gestured toward the SUVs. "Pack it up, now." Kane's composure cracked just slightly, his lips tightening as he measured his next move. His men shifted uneasily behind him, their silence suddenly less certain under the gaze of authority. Daniel felt his breath release. Though he didn't step back from the doorway, Elena stood as still as stone, her daughter's head pressed against her chest. Kane adjusted his tie, his voice low with restrained anger. "This isn't over." He turned sharply, signaling his men back. They obeyed without a word, slipping into the SUVs, engines rumbling back to life. Kane lingered a moment longer, his gaze fixed on Daniel, then on Elena, before finally turning away. The vehicles rolled out in slow procession, the sound of tires fading down the lane until the barn was quiet again. The deputies remained a few minutes longer, exchanging words with Daniel, reminding him that while no one could claim the land easily, men like Kane had ways of pressing through courts. "Stay cautious," the deputy warned. "You've stirred something deep." When they finally left, the silence returned, broken only by the rustle of wind through the barn's cracks. Daniel turned to Elena, his eyes full of questions. She met his gaze without flinching. "I called," she said simply, "the night he first came. I found an old phone in town. use it to leave word. I knew he'd return, and I wasn't going to let him take everything while we stood in the dark. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Daniel reached for her hand, gripping it tightly. Mateo exhaled, his tension finally breaking, and Sophia stirred against her mother, murmuring softly in her sleep. The barn had held its ground, not just with stone and secrets, but with the strength of a mother who refused to bow. And though the storm had only begun for that moment, the family stood unbroken. The morning after confrontation, the barn was hushed, though the silence no longer carried only fear. For the first time since they had stepped across its threshold, the family felt as though they were not standing entirely alone. The county deputies had forced Cain to retreat, but Daniel knew the reprieve was temporary. A man like Cain did not abandon what he wanted so easily. Yet in Elena's calm gaze and in the steady rhythm of Mateo's movements, there was a sense of something firmer, resolve. And when Sophia sat cross-legged on the floor, carefully redrawing the symbols she had memorized, it felt as though the barn itself approved. Late that afternoon, a car pulled into the lane. It was not one of Cain's black machines, but a modest sedan, the kind with more dust than shine. The engine cut off, and a tall woman stepped out, her arms filled with folders and leather-bound notebooks. She wore a heavy coat against the cold, her gray hair pulled back neatly, her glasses slipping slightly down her nose. She looked nothing like Cain and his men, yet when she reached the broken fence and raised her hand in greeting, there was a weight in her presence that made Daniel step forward without hesitation. "Mr. Rivera," she called, "I'm Professor Miriam Clark from the University in Montpelier. The sheriff contacted me after receiving word of discoveries on the Whitlock property. He said you might need verification." Her voice was firm but kind, and Daniel found himself nodding, though his guard did not drop. He led her inside the barn, Elena close behind, her hand resting protectively on Sophia's shoulder. Mateo lingered near the loft, watchful, his eyes never leaving the stranger. The professor took in the barn slowly, her gaze moving across the beams, the carvings, the dust that seemed to hum with history. "Remarkable," she murmured. "I've studied the Whitlocks. Farmers, yes, but also idealists. Some call them visionaries, others fools. Their disappearance after the Panic of '73 left more questions than answers." She paused, adjusting her glasses. "If you've uncovered what I think you have, you may be standing on a historical archive of extraordinary value." Daniel exchanged a glance with Elena, then guided her toward the cellar. The lantern's glow flickered across the stone as they descended, and when Professor Clark's eyes fell on the carvings, she stopped in her tracks. She reached out, running her fingers over the etched grain sheaf, the circle marked faith, the book labeled knowledge. Her expression softened, almost reverent. "This is intentional preservation," she whispered. They weren't hiding from time. They were writing to it. When Daniel and Mateo shifted the stones to reveal the crates, Clark bent low, pulling on gloves before handling the documents. She lifted a stock certificate, her eyes scanning the faded ink. "Authentic," she said immediately. "Railroads, mining, land holdings, most likely worthless in modern markets. But as records, priceless. This is evidence of how rural families sought to protect themselves from collapse." She turned the brittle page of a ledger, her voice quiet with awe. "It's a living history, untouched, unbroken." Daniel then led her to the hidden stall where the smaller chest lay. When she saw the envelope sealed with wax, her hand trembled. "Unheard of," she murmured. "Do you realize what this means? It's an intact archive from the Reconstruction era, preserved in secrecy. The state will have to recognize this site as historically significant." Elena spoke then, her voice low but steady. "Does that mean we can protect it? From men like Cain?" Professor Clark looked at her over the rims of her glasses. "It means more than that. Once this is verified through the university and cataloged, this barn cannot be claimed as private spoils. It will fall under protection, historical grounds. And you," her eyes shifted to Daniel and the children, "you will be recognized as custodians. The law will shield you where secrecy could not." For the first time in weeks, Daniel felt his chest loosen, though not completely. "Cain won't stop," he said quietly. "He'll find another way." Clark closed a journal she had been holding, her voice hardening. Then let him try. Once this archive is registered, any attempt to seize it will not only fail but expose him. The Whitlocks built this place to outlast collapse. Now the law will ensure it outlasts greed. Sophia tugged gently at her mother's sleeve, holding up one of her sketches. See, Mama, it really was a map. The professor says so. Elena bent to kiss her daughter's head, her eyes wet, her voice trembling with pride. Yes, me Nina. You were the first to see it. As the lantern flickered across the carved walls and the uncovered crates, the barn seemed to settle, its groans less like warnings and more like sighs of release. For the first time, their discoveries had drawn not only danger but protection, and in the presence of Professor Clark, the Whitlock legacy no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a shield. The weeks that followed blurred into a strange rhythm of fear and relief. Where once the barn had been only a refuge from wind and hunger, now it was visited by officials in heavy coats, archivists with gloves, and men and women carrying clipboards who walked the property with reverence. For Daniel, it was a surreal shift. He had braced himself for Kane's return, for another confrontation at the fence, but instead, it was the state that arrived. Professor Clark had kept her word. She had presented the journals, the ledgers, and even Sophia's sketches to university, which in turn had pressed the matter to the state. And so the barn, once ignored, was now declared something else entirely, a heritage site. The language of the decree was clinical, wrapped in legal terms Daniel struggled to follow, but its meaning was clear. The Whitlock archives were deemed historically significant, and the barn itself was to be preserved as a cultural landmark. No developer, no lawyer, no corporation could lay private claim to what had been sealed in its walls. For the first time since they had stumbled across Hollow Creek, the Riveras were safe, at least in the threat of eviction. The discovery of the chest had created a different storm. Experts appraised the gold and silver, weighing each coin and bar, testing authenticity. The numbers startled Daniel when he first heard them. The collection, alongside the deeds and stock certificates, was valued not only for its financial worth, but for its rarity. The figure spoken in hushed tones was millions, wealth so vast it seemed distant, almost fictional, yet it could not simply be handed over like a prize. The trust documents Whitlock himself had written were still binding, and the state agreed to honor them. The treasure would not enrich a single family, not even the Whitlock's lost heirs. Instead, it was tied to the very purpose Whitlock had recorded: education, preservation, and community survival. A foundation was formed, the Whitlock Trust, its charter drawn directly from the words penned in that second journal. It would fund scholarships, agricultural programs, and historical preservation projects across the state. The seeds found in their sealed jars became symbols of that mission. Heritage meant not to be hoarded, but planted, multiplied, and shared. For Elena, this truth carried a bittersweet weight. She had feared the barn's secrets, fear that they would destroy her family. Yet now she watched her children walk the aisles with historians and students, pointing out carvings and symbols that once frightened her. The same walls that had threatened to become a tomb had transformed into a schoolroom of sorts, a place where the past breathed in every beam. She stood taller when visitors arrived, her hand steady on Sophia's shoulder, her voice clear when asked about the family's first nights here. Mateo found himself drawn to the work crew's catalog in the archives. He hovered near the crates of documents, listening intently as archivists explained how deeds were cross-referenced, how ledgers told stories not of numbers but of lives. He no longer felt like a boy trapped by hunger, but a participant in something larger, something that connected his name to a history he could carry forward. And Sophia, with her sketches, became a quiet marvel. Scholars leaned over her drawings with wonder, astonished that a child had seen the connections between carvings that trained eyes had overlooked. They asked her questions gently, as though she were a peer rather than a little girl clutching a stuffed rabbit. For Daniel, those moments were both humbling and redemptive. His daughter's vision had opened the barn's secrets, her hand guiding them where he would have stumbled. When the official recognition came in writing, stamped and sealed, Daniel held the paper in his hands and read it aloud by lantern light. The words did not sound like triumph. They sounded like permanence. The barn was no longer theirs alone, nor Whitlock's, nor Kane's to covet. It belonged to history, protected under law, its wealth and legacy preserved not for one, but for all. That night, as the wind moved through the fields and the creek whispered softly beyond the fence, Elena sat beside Daniel on the barn's worn steps. She rested her head against his shoulder, her voice quiet. "We came here with nothing," she said, "and somehow we became keepers of everything." Daniel looked out at the horizon, the silhouette of the barn rising steady against the darkening sky. He thought of Whitlock's words of nourishment, knowledge, and faith. The barn had outlasted its builders, survived fire, famine, and greed. And now, in the hands of strangers who had once been homeless wanderers, its story would continue. The treasure no longer glittered only in gold or silver. It lived in the seeds and the papers, in the trust that bore Whitlock's name. It lived in Sophia's pencil strokes, in Mateo's restless curiosity, and in Elena's unyielding strength. A legacy preserved, not hidden, not squandered, a legacy that would endure. The barn no longer groaned with loneliness the way it had on their first night. Its boards still creaked, its rafters still whispered when the wind swept through the fields. But the sound had changed. What once felt like warnings now felt like a welcome, the voice of a place that had finally been seen for what it was. The Riveras had come here as wanderers, carrying little more than hunger and exhaustion, expecting nothing more than a roof to keep the cold from their children. Now they sat beneath those same beams as custodians of legacy, a family no longer adrift but anchored in history. The state's recognition of the Whitlock archives had transformed everything around them. Where once they had hidden, now they stayed openly. No more crouching in shadows when headlights cut across the fields. No more holding their breath at every knock on the door. The barn had been preserved by decree, its contents tied to a trust that no man could steal for himself. Cain had disappeared from the road, his suits and threats fading like a bad dream, replaced by officials, archivists, and visitors who came not to take but to learn. Yet when the scholars departed, when the inspectors folded their papers and left, it was the Riveras who remained. The barn had chosen them as much as they had chosen it. Elena hung blankets across the stalls, not as walls to hide behind, but as curtains that gave the children privacy. She swept the straw away and spread rugs scavenged from donation bins. Her hands, once weary with doubt, now worked with purpose, sewing patches, mending clothes, arranging jars of food along the beams. Sophia helped her, humming as she drew flowers and birds onto scraps of paper, taping them along the wood as though the barn deserved to be decorated, not mourned. Mateo spent hours in the loft, his eyes always drawn to the trapdoor that led to the cellar. He helped catalog what could be carried, copied down names from the deeds and certificates, and asked questions of every visitor who came to study the carvings. He no longer dreamed of leaving. He dreamed of becoming part of the story the barn told. He had shifted from restless boy to young guardian, his gaze sharp with the responsibility of knowing what lay hidden in the walls. Daniel felt the change most of all. He walked the perimeter of the fields each morning, tracing the fences as though claiming them by presence alone. When he returned to the barn, he no longer looked at it as a fragile shelter. It was theirs now, not in law, not in paper, but in truth. His hands built furniture out of broken boards. His shoulders straightened with each day. He could keep the family warm without fear of eviction. The journals remained on the plank table, and each night he read a few lines aloud, his voice calm, his children listening not with unease but with reverence. Elena, who had once begged him to leave, began to speak differently of the place. She told Sophia bedtime stories not of distant cities, but of the Whitlocks, of farmers who had carved their prayers into stone, so they might be remembered. She told Mateo that their presence here was not chance, but calling, and when Daniel listened to her voice in the quiet of evening, he heard no longer the quiver of fear, but the strength of someone who had claimed her place at last. The barn itself seemed to respond to their permanence. Light fell differently through the broken roof, casting golden beams onto the floor where the children played. The drafts felt less biting, softened by the warmth of rugs and blankets. The walls no longer pressed them with menace, but enclosed them like arms. And though the treasures of the Whitlocks had been sealed into trust, the Riveras carried their own wealth now. Dignity, belonging, and a roof that no one could tear away. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky burned orange over Hollow Creek, Daniel stood in the doorway with Elena at his side. Sophia sat cross-legged with her rabbit, drawing in her notebook, while Mateo read from one of the ledgers with a furrowed brow. Daniel breathed deeply, the cold air sharp but clean, and felt something he had not known in years, a peace that did not vanish when he opened his eyes. "This is home," Elena said softly, her voice steady. Daniel nodded, his arm brushing hers. They did not need a deed in their names or gold in their pockets. The barn had been meant to hold more than animals, more than secrets. It had been built to endure, to shelter, to preserve. And now, for the first time in too long, it held them, not as strangers, not as trespassers, but as family. The Riveras had found what the Whitlocks had left behind. Not just treasure, not just trust, but the promise that survival could become belonging. And so, within the weathered beams and hollow walls of an old barn, they found what they had sought most of all, a home